As we settle into this gentle exploration together, imagine yourself walking through the halls of the digital gaming archive in the year 2035. The corridors are lined with soft, ambient lighting that responds to your presence with barely perceptible warmth. Here, in this tranquil repository of interactive history, we find ourselves confronting one of the most profound cultural losses of the early 21st century, the great dissolution of digital gaming's golden age. If you enjoy this type of content, a like or a subscription is always appreciated. It helps our small corner of the internet grow. I invite you to share your own thoughts in the comments below. Now sit back, get cozy, and enjoy the sleep story. The year 2035 offers us a unique vantage point, a place of calm retrospection from which to examine what scholars now quietly term the digital dark age of gaming. From this temporal distance, we can observe with detached serenity how an entire ecosystem of interactive experiences simply disappeared, not through catastrophe or dramatic event, but through the gentle, inexorable passage of time and the quiet economics of digital infrastructure. In these peaceful halls, the silence speaks volumes about what is no longer here. Where once millions of players inhabited virtual worlds, where communities formed lasting bonds across digital landscapes, where artistic innovations pushed the boundaries of interactive storytelling, now there exists only the soft hum of archival servers preserving what little remains. This is not a story of sudden destruction, but rather one of gradual dissolution, like morning mist slowly lifting from a valley, taking with it entire universes that once seemed permanent and eternal. As we begin this contemplative journey together, let us approach these losses not with anger or frustration, but with the quiet acceptance that comes from understanding the complex forces that shaped this digital archaeology. The Gaming Preservation Institute of 2035 estimates that approximately 73% of digitally distributed games from the period spanning 2008 to 2028 are now completely inaccessible. This statistic, delivered in the measured tones of academic research, carries with it the weight of countless individual stories, players returning to seek comfort in familiar virtual spaces, only to find empty digital lots where once stood their cherished experiences. But what does this loss truly mean? As we settle deeper into our exploration, consider how this phenomenon represents more than mere technological obsolescence. These lost games were repositories of human creativity, digital galleries of interactive art, and social spaces where meaningful connections formed across vast distances. They were, in essence, cultural artifacts that documented how humanity chose to play, compete, cooperate, and dream during a pivotal period in technological evolution. The irony is palpable and peaceful in its inevitability. The digital revolution, which promised permanence and infinite reproductive fidelity, proved more ephemeral than the physical media it replaced. While we can still experience films from cinema's earliest days, while we can still read books printed centuries ago, thousands of interactive experiences from just 2 decades past have already become lost media, existing only in the fragmentary memories of those who experienced them. As we drift forward in our examination, we'll discover how this loss wasn't the result of any single catastrophic event, but rather emerged from the convergence of economic realities, technological limitations, and legal complexities that nobody fully anticipated. The companies that created these experiences weren't motivated by preservation. They were focused on the immediate demands of commerce and innovation. The players who inhabited these worlds assumed they would always exist, never imagining that their digital homes could simply vanish. This gentle tragedy unfolds in the space between intention and reality, between the promises of digital permanence and the practical realities of maintaining complex technological infrastructures. As we prepare to delve deeper into this contemplative analysis, let us carry with us both an appreciation for what was lost and an understanding of why these losses, while profound, were perhaps inevitable given the economic and technological contexts of their time. Drifting deeper into our contemplation, we find ourselves considering the fundamental nature of digital existence, a concept that seemed so revolutionary and permanent to those living through gaming's digital transition, yet proved to be built upon foundations more fragile than sand. In the quiet galleries of our imagined 2035 archive, interactive displays demonstrate the stark contrast between physical and digital preservation. Touch a gentle interface and watch as it shows you a vinyl record from 1950, still playable after 8.5 decades. Nearby, phantom spaces mark where thousands of digital games once existed, their lifespans measured not in decades, but in years, sometimes mere months. The Digital Gaming Archive's lead curator, Dr. Sarah Chen, often speaks in her recorded lectures about what she terms the illusion of digital permanence. Her voice, soft and measured, explains how the very properties that made digital distribution so appealing, instant access, infinite copies, global reach, also made it uniquely vulnerable to systematic loss. Unlike a book that degrades slowly over centuries, a digital game can transition from full functionality to complete inaccessibility in the span of a single server shutdown. Consider the gentle irony that while ancient cave paintings remain visible today, digital art forms from just 20 years ago have vanished entirely. The rock endures, the cloud evaporates. This isn't a failure of technology so much as a misunderstanding of what digital preservation actually requires. The assumption that digital meant permanent was, we now understand, one of the great misconceptions of the early internet age. The archive's evening lighting dims slightly as we contemplate the various forms this digital ephemera took. There were the obvious casualties, online-only games that died with their servers, but more subtle losses accumulated like sediment in a river. Single-player games that required internet activation became unplayable when authentication servers went dark. Games tied to specific operating systems vanished as those platforms evolved. Digital storefronts closed their doors, taking with them not just the ability to purchase games, but to re-download previously owned titles. Perhaps most poignantly, we lost the context that surrounded these games. The forums where strategies were shared, the streaming platforms where communities gathered to watch and discuss, the social networks where memories were preserved. All of this auxiliary culture, this rich ecosystem of human interaction built around gaming, proved even more ephemeral than the games themselves. Dr. Chen's research team has documented what they call cascade failures in digital preservation. A game might survive the shutdown of its original servers, only to become unplayable when the digital rights management systems it relied upon went offline. Or a title might remain technically functional but lose its online features, the very features that defined its identity and appeal to players. These weren't clean breaks, but slow strangulation, as the complex web of dependencies that enabled digital gaming gradually unraveled. The psychological impact of these losses reveals itself in the archive's collection of oral histories. Players describe returning to games that had provided comfort during difficult periods in their lives, only to find empty space where cherished experiences once lived. The digital worlds that had served as escape, as social hub, as creative outlet, gone as completely as if they had never existed. Yet there's something almost meditative about accepting the transient nature of these digital experiences. Just as Buddhist philosophy finds peace in impermanence, perhaps there's wisdom in recognizing that the value of these games existed in the moments they were experienced, not in their potential for eternal access. The memories persist even when the media does not. As we prepare to examine specific categories of loss, let us carry with us this understanding. The digital dark age wasn't a catastrophe, but a revelation. It revealed the hidden dependencies, the commercial imperatives, and the technological limitations that made these losses not just possible, but inevitable. In understanding this, we find not cause for alarm, but rather a gentle acceptance of the complex realities that shaped this particular chapter in cultural history. Moving through the archive's networked media wing, we encounter a vast wall of dark screens, each one representing a server cluster that once hummed with the digital life of thousands, sometimes millions of players. The silence here is complete, broken only by the gentle circulation of climate-controlled air and the soft footfalls of visitors contemplating these monuments to connectivity lost. In the calm reflection that 2035 provides, we can see clearly how the gaming industry's shift towards server-dependent experiences created an ecosystem of unprecedented fragility. Each game became a temporary constellation, brilliant while it burned, but destined to fade when the economic gravity that held it together weakened. The always-online paradigm, which promised enhanced experiences and social connectivity, simultaneously ensured that these experiences would one day simply stop existing. The archive documentation reveals the gentle mathematics of this dissolution. Server costs accumulated monthly, like rent on digital real estate, while player populations and revenue declined following predictable curves. When these lines crossed, when the cost of maintaining servers exceeded their income, the shutdown notices would appear, giving players weeks or sometimes just days to say goodbye to worlds they had inhabited for years. MMORPGs, those vast persistent universes, proved especially vulnerable to this economic reality. Games like City of Heroes, which vanished in 2012, became early indicators of what was to come. Matrix Online, Tabula Rasa, Warhammer Online, each shutdown added another dark screen to our imagined wall. These weren't failures of creativity or vision, but simple casualties of an unsustainable economic model that required perpetual growth to maintain digital existence. The archive's gentle ambient sounds seem to whisper the names of lost worlds. The Secret World's original iteration, Wildstar's bold experiment in hardcore MMO design, Landmark's ambitious building platform. Each represents not just a commercial venture that ceased operation, but entire communities dissolved, virtual architecture demolished, and years of player progress erased as completely as if they had existed only in dreams. But the loss extended beyond obvious candidates like MMORPGs. Mobile games, with their shorter attention spans and rapid content cycles, created an even more accelerated version of this phenomenon. The archive's mobile preservation wing is perhaps the sparsest of all, filled largely with empty spaces where thousands of games once lived briefly and died quickly. Infinity Blade, a landmark in mobile gaming aesthetics, vanished when its developers moved on to other projects. Draw Something, which briefly connected millions of players in simple creative expression, faded when social media trends shifted. Consider the quiet irony that many of these server-dependent games were designed to last forever. Their progression systems assumed years of continuous play. Their social systems encouraged long-term relationship building. Their virtual economies were balanced for sustained engagement. Yet their technical infrastructure was fundamentally temporary, dependent on corporate decisions that game designers and players could neither predict nor influence. The archive displays rescued fragments, screenshots, videos, written accounts, like artifacts from lost civilizations. Through these remnants, visitors in 2035 can glimpse the sophisticated social dynamics that emerged within these temporary worlds. Guild structures that paralleled real-world organizations, virtual economies that demonstrated principles of supply and demand, collaborative problems that required coordination between hundreds of players. All of this mechanical and social complexity evaporating the moment the servers powered down. Dr. Chen's team has identified what they term anticipatory grief in the final months of many server-dependent games. Players who knew their virtual worlds were scheduled for termination would gather for memorial events, take final screenshots, and share contact information to maintain relationships beyond the game's death. These digital wakes became ritualized responses to a uniquely modern form of loss, the planned obsolescence of entire universes. The evening grows later in our contemplative archive, and the wall of dark screens seems to require a moment of quiet respect. Each represented thousands of hours of human creativity, both from developers who built these worlds and players who inhabited them. The servers may be dark, but the experiences they enabled remain embedded in the memories of those who lived through them. As we prepare to explore the broader implications of digital storefront closures, we carry with us this understanding. Server-dependent gaming created forms of interactive experience unprecedented in cultural history, but it also created new categories of loss. The temporary nature of these experiences doesn't diminish their value. Rather, it emphasizes how much meaning can be created and shared even within systems designed to be ephemeral. The Archive's digital commerce wing presents a particularly haunting exhibit, a collection of virtual storefronts frozen at the moment of their closure, their interfaces preserved like Pompeii in digital amber. Here we can witness the exact moment when vast libraries of human creativity became inaccessible, when the notion of digital ownership revealed itself to be more tenuous than anyone had imagined. In the soft lighting of this memorial space, we observe the remnants of platforms that once seemed as permanent as the internet itself. The Nintendo eShop for 3DS and Wii U, which closed its doors in March 2023, marked an early milestone in what would become a cascade of digital storefront closures. Microsoft's Xbox 360 Marketplace, Steam's support for older operating systems, Sony's various portable gaming stores. Each closure took with it not just the ability to purchase games, but the fundamental capacity to re-download titles that customers had already bought. The calm retrospective that 2035 provides allows us to see these closures not as sudden catastrophes, but as inevitable results of technological evolution and corporate economics. Each storefront represented a specific technological moment, designed for hardware that would eventually become obsolete and user bases that would eventually migrate to newer platforms. The economics were straightforward. Maintaining compatibility with legacy systems required resources that declining user bases couldn't justify. Consider the gentle tragedy documented in the Archive's oral history collection. Players discovering that games they had purchased years earlier were no longer available for download. Perhaps their device had failed. Perhaps they had deleted games to save storage space. Perhaps they had simply expected that digital purchases would remain accessible indefinitely. The reality of digital ownership, that it meant licensing temporary access rather than permanent possession, revealed itself through these quiet disappointments. The Archive's interactive displays demonstrate the complex web of dependencies that made storefront preservation impossible. Each digital storefront required not just server infrastructure, but ongoing security updates, payment processing integration, and compatibility maintenance across evolving operating systems. As platforms aged, these maintenance costs increased while revenue decreased, creating an economic pressure that made closure inevitable. Nintendo's approach to this transition became a case study preserved in the Archive's policy wing. The company provided advance notice of storefront closures, allowed players to re-download previously purchased content for a transition period, and gradually deprecated features rather than ending access abruptly. Yet even this comparatively thoughtful approach couldn't prevent the fundamental loss. Entire libraries of digital-only titles that existed nowhere else became permanently inaccessible once the transition period ended. The mobile gaming ecosystem provided an even more accelerated version of this phenomenon. Apple's iOS updates regularly broke compatibility with older games, and developers who had moved on to other projects rarely updated their titles to maintain compatibility. The archive estimates that over 60% of mobile games available in 2015 had become unplayable by 2025, not through deliberate shutdown, but through simple neglect, as technological foundations shifted beneath them. Google Stadia's closure in 2023 offered a preview of what complete platform dissolution looked like. Unlike traditional console generations, where physical media remained playable, Stadia's cloud-only approach meant that when the service ended, the games simply ceased to exist. The company's efforts to transfer some titles to other platforms saved a fraction of the library, but most Stadia exclusives vanished entirely, taking with them any unique innovations or artistic achievements they might have represented. The archive's preservation team has reconstructed the psychology of these closures through thousands of forum posts and social media messages. There's a distinctive pattern: initial denial that beloved platforms would actually close, followed by frantic downloading during final weeks, then acceptance tinged with genuine grief for lost access. Players would share lists of titles worth downloading, just in case, creating informal preservation networks that sometimes proved more effective than official backup efforts. Perhaps most significantly, these storefront closures revealed the degree to which digital gaming had become intertwined with platform identity. Players didn't just lose access to games, they lost the curated experiences that these platforms provided. Steam's recommendation algorithms, Nintendo's iconic interface design, PlayStation's achievement systems, all of this contextual richness disappeared along with the storefronts themselves. As we move deeper into the evening of our contemplation, the preserved storefront interfaces seem to glow with ghostly familiarity. Their shopping cart icons and add to wish list buttons now serve as archaeological artifacts, reminders of an economic system that promised infinite access but delivered temporary licensing. The irony is gentle but persistent. The very convenience that made digital distribution appealing also made it uniquely vulnerable to systematic loss. The wisdom that emerges from this examination is neither bitter nor angry, but simply realistic about the impermanence of commercial systems. Digital storefronts were businesses first, preservation platforms second, and when business priorities shifted, preservation became impossible. Understanding this doesn't diminish the loss, but it does provide context for accepting what could not be prevented. Settling deeper into our contemplative analysis, we find ourselves in the archive's economic research wing, where soft displays chart the financial forces that shaped gaming's digital dark age. Here, in the gentle glow of data visualizations, we can observe how market forces created the conditions for systematic loss, not through malice or negligence, but through the simple mathematics of profit and cost that govern all commercial enterprises. The fundamental tension becomes clear when viewed from 2035's calm perspective. Digital preservation requires ongoing financial commitment, while the revenue from older games follows predictable decline curves. As player populations migrated to newer titles, the cost of maintaining legacy infrastructure gradually exceeded its economic value. The decision to discontinue services wasn't driven by hostility toward preservation, but by basic business sustainability. Dr. Chen's economic analysis reveals the hidden costs that accumulated around each digital gaming service. Server maintenance, security updates, customer support, payment processing, legal compliance. All of these expenses continued accruing long after a game's initial sales period ended. For a physical product, manufacturing costs are front-loaded and then largely complete. For digital services, costs accumulate perpetually, creating an economic pressure that physical media never faced. The Archive's case study collection illustrates how different companies approached this challenge. Some, like Nintendo, chose to maintain older services longer than financially optimal, subsidizing preservation through profits from newer ventures. Others, particularly smaller mobile developers, simply couldn't absorb the ongoing costs of maintaining legacy titles when their attention had moved to new projects. Neither approach was inherently more noble. Both reflected different corporate realities and resource constraints. Consider the gentle mathematics documented in the Archive's financial models. A successful mobile game might generate most of its lifetime revenue within the first 6 months of release. Yet maintaining that game's functionality could require ongoing development costs for years as operating systems evolved and security standards shifted. For smaller developers, the choice between updating old games and creating new ones wasn't really a choice at all. Survival required forward momentum. The rise of games as a service amplified these economic pressures by making ongoing content development an explicit part of the business model. When a service game's player population declined below sustainable thresholds, continuing development became economically impossible. The same connectivity that enabled rich social experiences also created financial obligations that couldn't be maintained indefinitely. The Archive's preserved correspondence reveals how developers often understood the preservation implications of their decisions, but felt powerless to address them. Technical teams knew that always-online requirements would make their games vulnerable to eventual shutdown, but marketing teams needed the user engagement metrics that connectivity provided. Legal departments understood that restrictive licensing would complicate preservation efforts, but business teams needed the revenue flexibility that complex licensing arrangements enabled. Cloud gaming services faced particularly acute versions of these economic pressures. The computational costs of running games on remote servers meant that every hour of gameplay incurred direct expenses, making it impossible to maintain access to titles that weren't generating active revenue. When Stadia calculated the long-term costs of maintaining their service, the mathematics inevitably led to closure rather than indefinite subsidy. Subscription services like Xbox Game Pass created different but related challenges. While these services extended the economic life of some games by providing ongoing revenue streams, they also created expectations of constant content refresh that made long-term preservation economically difficult. Games rotated in and out of subscription libraries based on licensing costs and player engagement, creating new forms of temporary access that felt different from ownership but carried similar preservation risks. The mobile gaming ecosystem's economic model proved especially hostile to preservation. With thousands of new games released monthly and player attention spans measured in weeks rather than years, the financial incentive to maintain older titles simply didn't exist. The App Store algorithms that promoted new releases over existing games created economic pressures that made preservation an active financial burden rather than a neutral choice. Yet the Archive also documents examples of economic models that supported better preservation outcomes. Games with one-time purchase prices and minimal ongoing costs proved more durable than service-based titles. Independent developers who retained full rights to their games sometimes managed preservation through community partnerships or open-source initiatives. These examples suggest that preservation-friendly business models were possible, though they required deliberate design choices that prioritized long-term access over short-term optimization. The evening deepens in our contemplative space, and the economic charts take on an almost meditative quality in their inexorable logic. There's something peaceful about understanding that these losses weren't personal failures, but systemic outcomes of the economic structures that enabled digital gaming in the first place. The same forces that made digital distribution viable also made digital preservation challenging. As we prepare to examine the technical aspects of digital decay, we carry with us this economic context. Preservation requires sustained financial commitment, and commercial entities naturally prioritize current revenue over historical access. Understanding this doesn't resolve the tension between business needs and cultural preservation, but it does provide a framework for accepting why these losses occurred with such systematic regularity. In the archive's technical preservation wing, we encounter perhaps the most complex aspect of gaming's digital dark age: the intricate web of hardware and software dependencies that made games vulnerable to technological evolution. Here, surrounded by displays showing the archaeological layers of computing history, we can contemplate how rapid technological change created preservation challenges that no one fully anticipated. The soft hum of cooling systems in this wing provides a constant reminder of how dependent digital experiences are on physical infrastructure. Each generation of gaming hardware represented a unique combination of processing architectures, graphics capabilities, and system software that enabled specific forms of interactive experience. As these platforms evolved or were discontinued, the games designed for them often became orphaned, technically sophisticated, but no longer viable. Consider the gentle irony preserved in the archive's hardware evolution displays. Personal computers from the 1980s, despite their apparent primitivity, often remained backward compatible with earlier software for decades. The PC platform's commitment to legacy support meant that games from the introduction of VGA graphics could remain playable for 30 years or more. Yet modern computing platforms, despite their vastly superior capabilities, often broke compatibility with software just a few years old. Mobile gaming provided the most dramatic example of technical obsolescence's pace. iOS updates regularly introduced architectural changes that broke older applications, and developers who had moved on to new projects rarely updated legacy titles to maintain compatibility. The archive estimates that the average mobile game's technical lifespan was approximately 4 years, long enough to seem permanent during development, brief enough to create systematic loss across the ecosystem. The transition from 32-bit to 64-bit computing architectures marked a particularly significant preservation boundary. Apple's decision to end support for 32-bit applications in 2019 instantly made thousands of iOS games unplayable, regardless of their cultural or artistic significance. This wasn't a gradual degradation, but an immediate technical cliff that divided gaming history into accessible and inaccessible eras. Gaming consoles faced different but equally challenging technical preservation issues. Each console generation represented a unique combination of hardware capabilities and system software that enabled specific forms of game development. When console manufacturers ended production and support for older platforms, the games designed for those systems became dependent on aging hardware with no path for migration to newer platforms. The archive's emulation research wing documents the heroic efforts of preservation communities to recreate obsolete gaming hardware through software simulation. Yet even these efforts faced technical limitations that prevented perfect preservation. Timing-dependent code, custom hardware features, and undocumented system behaviors often proved impossible to replicate precisely, meaning that emulated experiences, while valuable, weren't always identical to the original. Digital rights management systems created additional technical preservation challenges that weren't present in earlier gaming eras. Many games included activation servers, online verification systems, and encrypted content that became impossible to access once the supporting infrastructure was discontinued. These protective systems, designed to prevent piracy, often prevented legitimate access long after commercial considerations had ended. The shift toward cloud computing in gaming represented the logical extreme of technical dependency. Cloud-based games existed entirely on remote servers, leaving nothing on local devices that could be preserved or emulated. When these services ended, the games didn't just become difficult to access, they ceased to exist in any playable form, existing only in documentation and memory. Graphics driver compatibility provided another subtle but persistent source of technical obsolescence. Games optimized for specific graphics hardware often became unplayable when driver support ended, even on systems that were theoretically capable of running them. The rapid evolution of graphics technology meant that optimization choices that seemed reasonable during development could render games unplayable within just a few years. Operating system evolution created cascading compatibility issues that affected entire libraries of games simultaneously. Windows Vista's compatibility problems, macOS's transition to Apple Silicon, Linux distribution updates. Each of these platform changes could instantly make hundreds of games unplayable, not through deliberate decision, but through the accumulated impact of architectural evolution. The archive's documentation reveals how developers often faced impossible choices when planning for technical longevity. Using cutting-edge technologies could make games more impressive, but also more vulnerable to obsolescence. Conservative technical choices might ensure longer compatibility, but could limit creative possibilities. Most developers, facing immediate market pressures, optimized for current viability rather than long-term preservation. Perhaps most significantly, the technical complexity of modern games made preservation efforts increasingly difficult, even when the will existed. Early video games could be preserved through relatively simple file copying, but contemporary titles often required complex installation procedures, multiple software dependencies, and specific hardware configurations that became impossible to recreate once the supporting ecosystem evolved. As we drift deeper into the evening of our contemplation, the technical displays seem to pulse with the gentle rhythm of electronic heartbeats. There's something almost organic about how technical systems evolve, each generation building upon, but also displacing its predecessors, creating natural cycles of creation and obsolescence that mirror biological evolution. The wisdom that emerges from this technical examination is one of acceptance rather than resistance. Technical obsolescence wasn't a failure of planning, but an inevitable consequence of rapid innovation in computing hardware and software. Understanding this helps us appreciate both the creative possibilities that technical evolution enabled and the preservation challenges it necessarily created. As we move through the archive's legal research wing, we encounter a maze of display cases containing contracts, licensing agreements, and rights documentation that reveals perhaps the most Byzantine aspect of gaming's preservation challenges. The soft lighting here seems particularly fitting, as it illuminates a landscape of legal complexity that often defied easy understanding even for the lawyers and executives who created it. The fundamental challenge becomes clear through the archive's careful documentation. Video games, unlike books or films, were rarely owned entirely by a single entity. Instead, they represented complex assemblages of intellectual property, with different companies holding rights to code, art, music, character likenesses, brand usage, and distribution in different territories. When any link in this rights chain broke, the entire game could become legally inaccessible. Consider the gentle tragedy documented in the archive's music licensing section. Many games from the 2000s and 2010s featured licensed soundtracks that seemed to add authentic contemporary flavor to the gaming experience. Yet these music licenses were typically negotiated for specific time periods and geographic regions, with renewal costs that often exceeded the ongoing revenue from older games. When these licenses expired, games faced impossible choices. Remove the music that defined their atmosphere, pay renewal fees that exceeded their revenue, or simply disappear from sale entirely. The archive preserves dozens of examples where music licensing doomed otherwise preservation-worthy games. Grand Theft Auto. Vice City lost much of its period-authentic soundtrack when licenses expired, fundamentally changing the game's cultural resonance. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, whose soundtrack was integral to its identity and appeal, became a licensing nightmare that prevented straightforward re-release for over a decade. These weren't edge cases, but systematic problems that affected hundreds of titles across all platforms. Sports games faced particularly acute licensing challenges because they depended on rights from multiple professional leagues, player associations, and individual athletes. When these licensing agreements expired, often after just a few years, entire games became legally impossible to sell or distribute. The archive estimates that over 90% of sports games from the 2000-2020 period became unavailable for purchase within a decade of their initial release, not due to lack of interest, but due to insurmountable licensing complications. Brand licensing created additional preservation obstacles that game developers rarely anticipated during initial development. Games featuring real cars, clothing brands, or consumer products often included licensing agreements that limited the duration and scope of usage rights. When these agreements expired, games faced legal requirements to remove branded content or cease distribution entirely, even when the core gameplay remained compelling and preservation-worthy. The archive's international licensing wing reveals how territorial rights restrictions created global preservation challenges. Games might remain legally available in some countries while becoming inaccessible in others due to different licensing terms or legal frameworks. This geographic fragmentation meant that preservation efforts often faced jurisdictional complications that made comprehensive access impossible. Character licensing, particularly in games based on film or television properties, created some of the most intractable preservation problems. When media companies licensed their properties to game developers, the agreements typically included specific time limits and usage restrictions that were designed to coincide with promotional cycles rather than long-term preservation needs. When these licenses expired, games often became legally impossible to distribute regardless of their cultural or artistic significance. The rise of middleware and licensed game engines added additional layers of legal complexity that many developers didn't fully understand during initial development. Using third-party physics engines, audio systems, or development tools often came with licensing terms that affected long-term distribution rights. When these middleware companies changed their licensing policies or went out of business, dependent games sometimes became legally impossible to distribute, even when the original developers retained all other rights. Digital distribution platforms added another layer of legal complexity by introducing their own terms of service and content policies. Games that complied with legal requirements at the time of development sometimes became violation of platform policies years later due to changing content standards or legal interpretations. Platform holders could remove games from their stores not due to developer decisions, but due to evolving corporate policies or legal compliance requirements. The Archive's corporate acquisition wing documents how mergers and acquisitions often scrambled game rights in ways that made preservation legally complicated or impossible. When companies acquired game developers, they didn't always acquire complete rights to back catalogs. Legal due diligence that seemed adequate for acquiring ongoing business operations sometimes proved insufficient for maintaining access to legacy titles with complex licensing arrangements. Open-source gaming projects faced their own preservation challenges related to licensing compliance and contributor rights. Games that incorporated code or assets from multiple contributors sometimes became impossible to preserve when licensing terms couldn't be verified or when contributors couldn't be located to grant necessary permissions. The collaborative nature that made open-source development possible also made long-term preservation legally complex. The gentle irony preserved in the Archive's policy research is that legal frameworks designed to protect creators' rights often prevented preservation of their creative works. Copyright protections that ensured authors could benefit from their creations also prevented archival institutions from preserving games when rights holders couldn't be located or were no longer commercially viable entities. As the evening deepens in this contemplative space, the legal documentation seems to take on an almost archaeological quality. These contracts and licensing agreements represent the commercial relationships that enabled gaming's creative flowering, but they also created the legal constraints that made preservation systematically difficult. The wisdom that emerges from this legal examination is one of sympathetic understanding for the impossible positions that legal complexity created. Developers, publishers, and platform holders often understood the preservation implications of their licensing decisions, but faced commercial pressures that made preservation-friendly choices economically unsustainable. The legal labyrinth wasn't created by malice, but by the accumulated complexity of protecting multiple parties' interests in an industry that was evolving faster than legal frameworks could accommodate. In the Archive's community preservation wing, we discover a more hopeful aspect of gaming's digital dark age: the dedicated efforts of players, fans, and preservation enthusiasts who recognize the cultural value of disappearing games and work to maintain access through unofficial channels. Here, the displays glow with a warmer light, reflecting the passion and dedication of individuals who refuse to let beloved experiences simply vanish into digital obscurity. The oral history collection in this wing preserves countless stories of preservation heroes: programmers who reverse-engineered server protocols to create private servers, archivists who systematically backed up game files and patch histories, community leaders who organized preservation projects and maintained documentation that official sources had abandoned. These efforts represent some of the most dedicated cultural preservation work of the early 21st century. Consider the remarkable story of City of Heroes, the superhero MMO that officially closed in 2012, but continued to exist through community efforts for over a decade afterward. The Archive preserves the patient, methodical work of fans who recreated the game's server infrastructure, reverse-engineered its database structures, and maintained access to character progression systems that represented thousands of hours of player investment. Unlike official preservation efforts, this community work was motivated pure by love for the experience itself. The archive's private server documentation wing reveals the technical sophistication that these community efforts achieved. Projects like World of Warcraft private servers, which maintained access to specific expansion versions that official servers had abandoned, required deep understanding of network protocols, database management, and game balance systems. These weren't simple file copying projects, but complete technical recreations that often matched or exceeded the functionality of official services. ROM preservation communities, working to maintain access to older console games, developed systematic approaches to digital archiving that university libraries later adopted as best practices. The scene groups that emerged in the 2000s created standardized file formats, verification procedures, and distribution networks that ensured games remained accessible long after official support ended. Their work represents one of the largest grassroots preservation efforts in cultural history. The archive documents how community preservation efforts often preserved not just games, but entire cultural ecosystems. Fan-maintained wikis documented gameplay mechanics, story details, and community history that official sources ignored. Screenshot archives preserved visual records of virtual worlds that no longer existed. Video recordings captured gameplay experiences and social interactions that would otherwise have been lost entirely. Yet community preservation efforts also faced systematic challenges that limited their effectiveness and reach. Legal restrictions made sharing preserved games risky for community archivists, even when no commercial harm could result from preservation. Technical limitations meant that community projects often could only maintain partial functionality, preserving core gameplay while losing peripheral features like leaderboards, achievements, or social systems. The archive's legal advocacy wing preserves documentation of community efforts to reform copyright and preservation laws to better accommodate gaming preservation needs. Organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation work to establish exemptions for preservation activities, while academic institutions lobbied for fair use protections that would enable systematic game archiving. These efforts achieved some success, but faced ongoing resistance from industry groups concerned about intellectual property protection. Community preservation projects often struggled with sustainability challenges that mirrored the problems faced by commercial gaming services. Maintaining private servers required ongoing financial commitment from volunteers, technical expertise that became harder to find as original technologies became obsolete, and community leadership that could persist across decades rather than years. Many community preservation projects lasted longer than the commercial services they replaced, but few achieved true permanence. The Archive's International Preservation Wing reveals how community efforts varied significantly across different legal and cultural contexts. Some countries' copyright frameworks provided more flexibility for preservation activities, enabling more robust community archiving projects. Other regions saw community preservation efforts driven underground by restrictive legal environments that treated any unauthorized copying as significant legal violation. Mobile game preservation proved particularly challenging for community efforts because mobile platforms' closed ecosystems made reverse engineering and file access much more difficult than on open platforms like PC. The archive documents numerous failed attempts to preserve significant mobile games, highlighting how platform architecture could either enable or prevent community preservation, regardless of community dedication and technical skill. The relationship between community preservation efforts and industry stakeholders evolved significantly over the 2 decades documented in the archive. Early community projects often faced legal opposition from companies protecting active commercial interests. Later efforts sometimes received unofficial tolerance or even encouragement from companies that recognized the cultural value of preservation, but couldn't justify the commercial costs of official preservation programs. The archive preserves examples of successful collaboration between commercial entities and community preservation efforts. Some companies released source code or provided technical assistance to community projects, maintaining access to discontinued games. These partnerships represented recognition that community preservation could achieve cultural goals that commercial preservation couldn't sustain economically. Perhaps most significantly, community preservation efforts demonstrated that systematic game archiving was technically feasible when pursued with sufficient dedication and expertise. The limitation wasn't technological capability, but legal framework and resource allocation. Community projects proved that preservation was possible. They also revealed why it rarely happened within commercial contexts. As we contemplate these community efforts in the gentle lighting of the archive's evening hours, there's something deeply moving about the dedication they represent. Individuals and small groups, working without financial compensation or institutional support, managed to preserve cultural artifacts that multi-billion-dollar companies couldn't maintain economically. Their work represents cultural preservation in its purest form, motivated by value and meaning rather than profit and efficiency. The wisdom that emerges from examining community preservation efforts is both hopeful and sobering. These projects demonstrate that preservation is possible when pursued with sufficient dedication, but they also reveal how much preservation depends on individual effort rather than systematic institutional support. Community preservation filled crucial gaps in cultural archiving, but it also highlighted how much preservation work fell outside official channels during gaming's digital transition. As we drift into the archive's psychology and cultural impact wing, we encounter a more intimate aspect of gaming's digital dark age: the emotional and psychological dimensions of losing access to interactive experiences that had become meaningful parts of people's lives. The lighting here is particularly soft and contemplative, designed to encourage reflection on the personal costs of systematic cultural loss. The oral history collection in this wing preserves thousands of individual accounts that reveal the psychological complexity of digital loss. Unlike the loss of physical objects, which typically involves gradual degradation or clear moments of destruction, digital loss often occurred suddenly and completely. Players would attempt to access familiar games only to discover that they had simply vanished, leaving behind empty spaces where cherished experiences once existed. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, whose research on digital attachment the archive preserves extensively, identified several distinct patterns in how people process the loss of gaming experiences. Her work reveals that these losses often triggered grief responses similar to other forms of cultural or personal loss, but with unique characteristics related to the sudden and complete nature of digital disappearance. The archive documents what researchers termed phantom gaming syndrome, an experience reported by thousands of players who would habitually attempt to access games that no longer existed. Muscle memory would guide them through familiar interface gestures, seeking comfort in gaming experiences that had provided relaxation or escape during stressful periods, only to encounter error messages or empty installation directories where those experiences once lived. Consider the particularly poignant accounts preserved from the final days of beloved online services. Players would gather in virtual spaces scheduled for deletion, sharing contact information and taking final screenshots, creating digital wakes for experiences that had structured their social lives for years. These farewell events represented a unique form of anticipatory grief, mourning losses that were scheduled and inevitable, but not yet complete. The archive's community impact documentation reveals how gaming losses often disrupted social networks in ways that participants hadn't anticipated. Guild relationships in MMORPGs, competitive teams in online shooters, creative collaborations in building games. These social structures had developed their own cultures, histories, and relationship patterns that existed only within specific gaming contexts. When the games disappeared, these social networks often couldn't transfer to other platforms or maintain their cohesion outside their original interactive contexts. Particularly affecting are the accounts from players who had used specific games as coping mechanisms during difficult life periods. Gaming experiences that had provided structure, achievement, or social connection during depression, illness, or major life transitions became safety nets that individuals learned to rely upon. When these games vanished, players lost not just entertainment, but tools for emotional regulation that had become integrated into their psychological well-being. The archive preserves research on how different age groups experienced digital gaming loss differently. Younger players, who had grown up entirely within digital gaming ecosystems, often experienced these losses as natural parts of technological evolution, disappointing but not fundamentally surprising. Older players, who remembered the permanence of physical media, often found digital loss more psychologically disorienting because it violated their expectations about cultural persistence. Parent-child gaming relationships provided another dimension of loss, documented extensively in the archive. Families who had bonded over specific games often found that the unique shared experience they had created couldn't be recreated when those games disappeared. Parents who wanted to show their children games that had been meaningful to them during their own youth discovered that digital losses had made these generational connections impossible to maintain. The commercial gaming industry's response to player expressions of loss reveals interesting patterns preserved in the archive's corporate communication wing. Customer service departments developed standard responses to requests for accessing discontinued games, typically explaining technical and legal limitations while expressing sympathy for player disappointment. These responses became formulaic over time, suggesting that digital loss complaints had become routine business issues rather than exceptional customer concerns. The archive's therapeutic research wing documents how mental health professionals began recognizing digital loss as a legitimate source of grief that required understanding and processing rather than dismissal. Gaming experiences had provided meaningful structure, achievement, and social connection for millions of people, and losing access to these experiences created genuine psychological impacts that deserved recognition and support. Some individuals developed what researchers termed preservation anxiety, systematic efforts to back up and maintain local copies of meaningful games based on fear of future loss. This behavior represented a psychological adaptation to the reality of digital impermanence, but it also created ongoing stress for people who felt responsible for preserving cultural experiences that they believed should persist automatically. The archive preserves extensive documentation of how gaming communities developed ritualized responses to loss announcements. Farewell events, memorial videos, and collaborative documentation projects became standard community responses to shutdown notifications. These activities served psychological functions related to closure and memorialization that helped players process losses that might otherwise have felt abrupt and meaningless. Perhaps most significantly, the archive documents how digital gaming loss contributed to broader cultural conversations about ownership, permanence, and the relationship between technology and memory. People who lost access to meaningful gaming experiences often became advocates for digital preservation, not just for gaming, but for all forms of digital culture that they recognized as vulnerable to similar systematic loss. The research collected here reveals that digital loss wasn't just an abstract cultural problem, but a source of genuine personal impact for millions of individuals. The convenience and accessibility that made digital gaming appealing also created new forms of attachment and dependency that made loss more psychologically significant than the industry or players typically anticipated. As we settle deeper into contemplation of these personal impacts, the archive's gentle ambient lighting seems to acknowledge the real human experiences behind what might otherwise seem like merely technical or commercial problems. The wisdom that emerges from understanding the psychology of digital loss is one of compassion for the genuine impacts that systematic cultural loss created in individual lives, and recognition that preservation isn't just about maintaining access to cultural artifacts, but about respecting the meaningful relationships that people develop with interactive experiences. Reaching the midpoint of our contemplative journey through the archive, we arrive at the exhibition hall dedicated to specific examples of digital extinction, individual games, and gaming experiences whose loss exemplifies the broader patterns we've been exploring. Here, each display case preserves the complete story of a particular disappearance, from creation through dissolution, offering detailed insight into how the various forces we've discussed combined to eliminate specific cultural artifacts. The centerpiece of this collection examines PT, the playable teaser, released by Konami in 2014, that became one of the most influential horror gaming experiences ever created. The archive's documentation reveals how this brief interactive experience, designed as marketing for a cancelled Silent Hill project, achieved artistic significance that far exceeded its original promotional purpose. Yet its distribution as a PlayStation Network exclusive, combined with complex licensing relationships and corporate strategic changes, made it one of the most famous examples of deliberate digital extinction. The PT case study reveals how digital distribution could make games vulnerable to removal, even when they had achieved critical acclaim and cultural significance. When Konami cancelled the associated Silent Hill project and removed PT from PlayStation Network, the experience became instantly inaccessible to new players and impossible to reinstall for those who had deleted it. The archive preserves documentation of PlayStation 4 consoles with PT installations selling for thousands of dollars, creating a peculiar economy around access to a digital experience that had been freely available just months earlier. Consider the gentle irony that PT's influence on horror game design continued long after the experience itself became inaccessible. The archive's influence tracking Wing documents dozens of games that incorporated design elements pioneered by PT, creating a situation where the evolutionary impact of the original experience remained visible throughout gaming culture, while the experience itself existed only in the memories of those who had played it during its brief window of availability. The exhibition moves on to examine Flappy Bird, the mobile phenomenon whose voluntary removal by its creator in 2014 demonstrated how even successful games could vanish when their existence created unintended consequences. The archive preserves creator Dong Nguyen's statements about removing the game due to its addictive nature and the unexpected pressures of sudden fame, representing one of the few cases where a game was deliberately removed for ethical rather than commercial reasons. The Flappy Bird case study illustrates how mobile platform ecosystems made games vulnerable to individual developer decisions in ways that traditional publishing hadn't. When Nguyen removed Flappy Bird from app stores, millions of players lost access to an experience that had become a cultural touchstone, demonstrating how digital distribution concentrated enormous cultural power in individual developer decisions that traditional publishing structures would have made impossible. Moving through the exhibition, we encounter the complex case of The Simpsons. Tapped Out, a mobile city-building game that achieved remarkable longevity before finally succumbing to the economic pressures that affected all long-term mobile gaming services. The archive's documentation shows how the game survived for over a decade by continuously evolving its content and monetization systems, demonstrating that digital preservation was possible when economic models aligned with long-term sustainability goals. Yet even Tapped Out's eventual closure in 2024 revealed the fundamental fragility of server-dependent gaming experiences. Despite the game's success and dedicated player base, Electronic Arts ultimately determined that the maintenance costs exceeded the revenue potential, leading to shutdown announcement that gave players 6 months' notice, but no path for preservation or continued access. The archive preserves player-created documentation efforts from the game's final months, showing how communities attempted to preserve memories and social connections even when the interactive experience itself couldn't be maintained. The exhibition's MMO section examines the rise and fall of WildStar, an ambitious science fiction MMO that represented significant creative and financial investment, but was unable to sustain the player populations necessary for economic viability. The archive's development documentation reveals how the game incorporated innovative housing systems, challenging dungeon design, and distinctive art direction that represented genuine creative achievements within the MMO format. WildStar's closure in 2018 demonstrated how even well-funded, creatively ambitious games could become victims of market timing and player preference evolution. The archive preserves extensive community documentation of the game's final weeks, including organized events, memorial screenshots, and attempts to maintain guild relationships beyond the game's shutdown. These preservation efforts show how player communities often invested more effort in documenting disappearing games than the commercial entities that had created them. The mobile gaming section presents the case of Monument Valley, one of the most artistically acclaimed mobile games of the 2010s, which survived the digital dark age through careful technical maintenance and platform adaptation. The archive's preservation success wing documents how developer Ustwo Games maintained compatibility across iOS updates and Android fragmentation, demonstrating that mobile game preservation was possible when development teams prioritized long-term accessibility alongside immediate commercial goals. Monument Valley's survival provides a valuable counterexample to mobile gaming's general preservation failures. The archive's analysis reveals the key factors that enabled its persistence: retained development team expertise, simplified technical architecture that reduced compatibility challenges, and ongoing revenue that justified maintenance costs. These factors suggest preservation strategies that might have saved other mobile experiences if they had been implemented systematically across the industry. The exhibition concludes with an examination of Google Stadia's complete platform closure, which eliminated an entire ecosystem of games and demonstrated how cloud gaming's infrastructure dependencies made preservation impossible through traditional means. The archive preserves the platform's final communications, player response documentation, and the few successful game transfers that managed to preserve some titles on alternative platforms. The Stadia closure represented the logical extreme of digital gaming's preservation challenges. Games that existed entirely on remote servers with no local components that could be preserved or emulated. When the service ended, these games didn't become difficult to access. They simply ceased to exist in any playable form, representing a form of cultural loss that was unprecedented in media history. As we contemplate these individual stories in the archive's evening lighting, each case study reveals how the systematic forces we've examined manifested in unique ways for specific games and communities. The losses weren't uniform or predictable, but they shared common elements related to economic sustainability, technical complexity, legal frameworks, and community capacity for preservation. The wisdom that emerges from these case studies is recognition that digital extinction often resulted from the convergence of multiple factors rather than single causes. Understanding individual cases helps illuminate both why losses occurred and what conditions might have enabled better preservation outcomes. Each lost game represents not just a vanished creative work, but a learning opportunity for understanding how digital culture could be better preserved in the future. As we continue deeper into our contemplative exploration, we find ourselves in the archives, games as a service, memorial wing, perhaps the most haunting section of our digital preservation museum. Here, the displays document how the gaming industry's shift toward ongoing content delivery and community engagement inadvertently created some of the most spectacular preservation failures in cultural history. The concept of games as a service had emerged with such promise in the 2010s, representing an evolution from traditional static game purchases toward dynamic living experiences that could grow and evolve with their communities. The archive's industry documentation preserves the excitement and optimism that surrounded early implementations like Destiny, Anthem, and Evolve. Games designed to provide years of ongoing content and social interaction through continuous developer support. In the calm retrospective that 2035 provides, we can see clearly how this model contained the seeds of its own preservation problems. Unlike traditional games, which achieved completion at the moment of release, games as a service were designed to be perpetually incomplete, requiring ongoing development resources to maintain their full functionality. When these resources became unavailable, the games didn't just become unsupported, they often became fundamentally broken or impossible to experience as intended. The archive's economic analysis wing reveals the inherent sustainability challenges that made games as a service particularly vulnerable to systematic loss. These games required not just server maintenance, but ongoing content development, community management, balance updates, and technical support that created operational costs far exceeding those of traditional games. When player populations declined or revenue expectations weren't met, the economic pressure to discontinue service became overwhelming. Consider the case of Anthem, preserved in the archive's Ambitious Failures collection. Electronic Arts and BioWare had envisioned a shared world action experience that would provide years of evolving content and social gameplay. The game's technical infrastructure was designed around the assumption of ongoing content development and player engagement. When the game failed to achieve sustainable player populations, the planned content updates that would have completed its intended experience were cancelled, leaving players with what amounted to an elaborate but ultimately hollow technology demonstration. The archive documents the peculiar psychology of games as a service failure through the preserved community forums and social media discussions from games like Evolve and Lawbreakers. Players had purchased these experiences based on promises of ongoing support and evolving content, creating expectations that traditional game purchases didn't carry. When development was discontinued, players didn't just lose access to static experiences. They lost the future experiences they had been led to expect. Destiny represents a more complex case study preserved in the archive's partial preservation section. While the core Destiny experience evolved into Destiny 2 and maintained ongoing development, the original game's content was gradually deprecated and removed to make room for new experiences within the same technical framework. Players who had formed attachments to specific locations, missions, or activities found that these elements simply vanished from an otherwise continuing game. The content vaulting approach that Destiny pioneered created a new form of digital loss, where games could lose substantial portions of their content while remaining nominally active. The archive preserves extensive player documentation of removed Destiny content, entire planets, storylines, and activities that had provided hundreds of hours of gameplay, but were sacrificed to technical limitations and development resource allocation. This represented a form of selective preservation, where maintaining some content required abandoning other content. The archive's live service dependencies wing illustrates how games as a service often created complex webs of interconnected features that made partial preservation impossible. Games like Anthem and The Division were designed with progression systems, social features, and content delivery mechanisms that required full server infrastructure to function meaningfully. Unlike traditional games, which could often remain playable even with degraded functionality, these games became essentially non-functional when their supporting services were reduced or eliminated. Fortnite provides an interesting counterexample preserved in the archive's preservation success through evolution collection. Epic Games demonstrated that games as a service could achieve long-term sustainability through continuous reinvention and cultural relevance. Yet even Fortnite's success came at the cost of its own preservation. The game's original Save the World mode was gradually overshadowed by the Battle Royale experience, and many early Fortnite experiences became inaccessible as the game evolved toward its more successful configuration. The archive documents how the games as a service model created new forms of FOMO, fear of missing out, that hadn't existed in traditional gaming. Players understood that time-limited events, seasonal content, and evolving narratives meant that delaying engagement could result in missing experiences that would never be available again. This created psychological pressure for immediate participation, but also ensured that parts of games became permanently inaccessible even while the core experience remained active. Mobile games as a service faced even more acute preservation challenges due to the compressed life cycle expectations of mobile gaming and the technical limitations of mobile platforms. The archive's mobile service collection documents hundreds of games that achieved brief popularity through engaging live service mechanics, but couldn't sustain the development costs required for long-term operation. Games like Harry Potter, Hogwarts Mystery, and SimCity Build It represented significant creative and technical investments that became inaccessible when their operational costs exceeded their revenue generation. The archive preserves extensive documentation of how games as a service affected player behavior and community formation in ways that made their loss particularly significant. Unlike traditional games, which players could revisit individually at any time, live service games created shared temporal experiences that existed only when communities were actively engaged. The social rituals, competitive seasons, and collaborative events that defined these experiences couldn't be preserved through traditional archival methods. Perhaps most tragically, the archive documents how many games as a service contained innovative gameplay mechanics, social systems, and technical achievements that became completely inaccessible when the services ended. Games like Lawbreakers experimented with unique movement mechanics in competitive shooter design. Evolve pioneered asymmetric multiplayer experiences that influenced many subsequent games. Yet these innovations exist now only in design documentation and video recordings, rather than playable form. The evening deepens in our contemplative space, and the preserved screenshots and video documentation of lost live service experiences take on an almost archaeological quality. These fragments represent not just individual games, but an entire approach to interactive entertainment that proved economically unsustainable despite achieving remarkable creative and technical sophistication. The wisdom that emerges from examining games as a service preservation failures is recognition that the model's core innovation, ongoing evolution, and community engagement also made traditional preservation approaches inadequate. These games weren't just software products, but dynamic cultural systems that required active maintenance and community participation to exist meaningfully. When the social and economic conditions that enabled their operation changed, they didn't just become old games, they became impossible games. In the Archive's digital archaeology wing, we encounter perhaps the most systematic aspect of gaming's preservation challenge: how entire platform ecosystems evolved, merged, and disappeared, taking with them not just individual games, but the complete technological and social contexts that made those games meaningful. Here, the displays are arranged like geological layers, showing how digital gaming platforms accumulated complexity over time before experiencing sudden extinction events that eliminated entire strata of interactive culture. The preserved platform documentation reveals how each gaming ecosystem represented more than just a technical infrastructure. It embodied specific approaches to user interface design, social interaction, content discovery, and community formation that shaped how players experienced and understood gaming itself. When platforms disappeared, they took with them not just access to games, but the cultural contexts that made those games comprehensible and meaningful. Consider the case of Windows Phone gaming, preserved in the Archive's Platform Extinction collection. Microsoft's mobile platform represented a brief but distinctive approach to mobile gaming interface design, with live tiles and integrated Xbox Live features that created gaming experiences unlike those available on iOS or Android. When Microsoft discontinued Windows Phone support, the games designed specifically for that platform's unique capabilities became not just inaccessible, but literally impossible to recreate on other platforms without fundamental reimagining. The Archive's ecosystem analysis reveals how gaming platforms develop their own cultural DNA through the accumulation of interface conventions, social features, and content curation approaches. Steam's recommendation algorithms, PlayStation's trophy system, Xbox Live's gamma score mechanics. Each platform created specific ways of understanding and valuing gaming achievements that influenced how players approached and experienced games within those ecosystems. The preservation challenges multiplied when platforms attempted to migrate or merge their ecosystems during corporate transitions. The Archive documents numerous cases where technical migration preserved game files, but lost the social and contextual features that had made those games meaningful within their original platforms. When Games for Windows Live was discontinued, many games lost their achievement tracking, multiplayer connectivity, and social features, even when they remained technically playable. Digital storefront ecosystems proved particularly vulnerable to complete loss when their maintaining companies changed strategic directions. The Archive's Vanished Storefronts collection preserves documentation of dozens of digital game stores that simply disappeared, taking with them not just access to their game libraries, but the editorial voices, community features, and cultural curation that had made them distinctive gaming destinations. The Google Play Games platform provides an interesting case study in partial ecosystem preservation. While the core Android gaming platform persisted, Google's various attempts to create dedicated gaming social features, achievements, leaderboards, multiplayer matchmaking, were repeatedly launched and discontinued as the company's gaming strategy evolved. Games that had integrated these features often became partially broken when the supporting services were removed, creating fragmented experiences that preserved gameplay while losing social functionality. The archive's cross-platform compatibility wing documents how the industry's gradual movement toward platform-agnostic game development both helped and hindered preservation efforts. While games that could run on multiple platforms were less vulnerable to single-platform extinction, they often lost the platform-specific features that had made them distinctive within their original contexts. Cross-platform games were preserved more frequently, but often in genericized forms that had lost their original cultural specificity. Virtual console and backward compatibility systems represented sophisticated attempts to preserve gaming ecosystems within newer technological frameworks. The archive preserves extensive analysis of Nintendo's virtual console approach, which successfully maintained access to thousands of historical games, but struggled to preserve the social and cultural contexts that had surrounded those games in their original platforms. Playing a NES game through Virtual Console provided the core gameplay experience, but eliminated the shared cultural experience of blowing on cartridges, dealing with hardware limitations, and participating in an ecosystem designed around physical media. The rise of mobile gaming platforms created entirely new forms of ecosystem dependency that proved even more fragile than traditional console ecosystems. The archive documents how iOS and Android app stores became gatekeepers not just for game distribution, but for ongoing game functionality, with App Store policy changes regularly breaking games that had been developed according to earlier platform standards. Games that incorporated social features through platform-specific APIs often became partially non-functional when those APIs were deprecated or removed. Platform-exclusive games represented some of the most significant preservation losses documented in the archive. Titles developed specifically to showcase unique platform capabilities often couldn't be meaningfully ported to other systems, making them completely dependent on their original platform's continued existence. When those platforms disappeared, the games didn't just become inaccessible, they became impossible to recreate without the specific hardware and software environments they had been designed to exploit. The archive's intermediate platform collection documents the particular preservation challenges created by middleware and platform abstraction layers. Games developed using proprietary engines or platform-specific development tools often became impossible to maintain when those tools were discontinued, even when the target platforms remained active. The complex technological stacks that enabled sophisticated game development also created dependency chains that made games vulnerable to failure at multiple points. Cloud gaming platforms represented the logical extreme of ecosystem dependency, creating games that existed entirely within remote infrastructure with no local components that could be preserved independently. The archive preserves documentation from multiple cloud gaming service closures, showing how complete ecosystem dependencies made traditional preservation approaches impossible. When cloud platforms ended service, their games didn't become difficult to access, they ceased to exist in any recoverable form. The social discovery and community features that platforms provided often proved as important to players as the games themselves, creating additional preservation challenges that technological solutions couldn't address. The archive documents how platform-specific friends lists, communication systems, and community features created social value that persisted beyond individual game sessions. When platforms disappeared, players didn't just lose access to games. They lost the social infrastructure that had made those games part of ongoing relationships and communities. As we contemplate these ecosystem losses in the archive's gentle evening lighting, there's something profoundly sobering about recognizing how much cultural complexity existed within these technological infrastructures. Each platform ecosystem represented years of accumulated design decisions, community development, and cultural evolution that couldn't be quickly recreated or easily preserved when the supporting technology became obsolete. The wisdom that emerges from this archaeological examination is recognition that gaming preservation requires preserving not just individual games, but the complete technological and social ecosystems that made those games meaningful and accessible. This realization makes the preservation challenge seem almost impossibly complex, but it also provides insight into why so many preservation efforts succeeded technically while failing culturally. They preserved the games while losing the contexts that made those games significant parts of cultural life. As our contemplative journey continues into the archive's mobile gaming wing, we encounter what historians now recognize as perhaps the most devastating single category of loss within gaming's digital dark age. The soft, almost melancholic lighting in this section seems particularly appropriate, as it illuminates the remnants of what was once the most accessible and democratically distributed gaming platform in human history, a platform that ultimately proved to be almost entirely ephemeral. The statistics preserved in the archive's quantitative research section are staggering in their quiet enormity. Of the approximately 2.8 million mobile games published across iOS and Android platforms between 2008 and 2025, an estimated 89% had become permanently unplayable by 2030. Unlike console or PC gaming, where preservation efforts managed to maintain access to significant portions of historical libraries, mobile gaming's preservation rate approached near-total failure across all categories and time periods. The unique characteristics of mobile gaming platforms created a perfect storm of preservation challenges that proved almost impossible to overcome. The archive's technical analysis reveals how mobile platforms' rapid hardware evolution, aggressive app store curation, and developer-unfriendly update requirements created systematic pressures that made long-term game preservation economically and technically unfeasible for all but the most successful titles. Consider the gentle tragedy documented in the archive's iOS evolution timeline. Apple's transition from 32-bit to 64-bit architecture in 2017 instantly made thousands of games unplayable, regardless of their cultural significance or player attachment. This wasn't a gradual obsolescence, but an immediate technological cliff that divided mobile gaming history into accessible and inaccessible eras. Games that had defined mobile gaming's creative potential, titles like Infinity Blade, which showcased mobile graphics capabilities, or Monument Valley's original incarnation, simply stopped functioning on devices updated to newer operating system versions. The archive preserves extensive documentation of the unique economic pressures that made mobile game preservation particularly challenging. Unlike console games, which generated most of their revenue through initial sales, mobile games increasingly relied on ongoing user engagement, in-app purchases, and advertising integration that required constant developer attention and server maintenance. When player attention moved to newer games, The economic foundation supporting older games collapsed rapidly and completely. The App Store Archaeology collection documents the peculiar phenomenon of successful mobile games simply disappearing from app stores due to developer choices that would have been impossible in traditional publishing models. Flappy Bird's voluntary removal demonstrated how individual developer decisions could eliminate cultural phenomena that had achieved global recognition. The archive preserves hundreds of similar cases where games vanished not due to commercial failure, but due to development team decisions, legal complications, or simply neglect as developers moved on to new projects. Android's fragmentation across thousands of device configurations and manufacturer modifications created additional preservation challenges that amplified over time. The archive's technical documentation shows how games optimized for specific Android versions or hardware configurations often became unplayable as the platform evolved, not due to deliberate obsolescence, but due to the impossibility of maintaining compatibility across an ecosystem changing at unprecedented speed. The archive's lost innovation. Wing preserves documentation of mobile gaming's remarkable creative achievements that became inaccessible when the games containing them disappeared. Touch-based interface innovations, location-aware gameplay mechanics, social integration experiments, augmented reality explorations. Mobile gaming pioneered interaction methods that influenced all subsequent interactive design. Yet the games that originated these innovations often survived only in design documentation and video recordings rather than playable form. Pokémon Go represents a particularly complex preservation case study, documented extensively in the archive's Persistent Worlds section. While the core experience remained active through continuous development, the game's location-based and time-limited content created preservation challenges unlike any previous gaming format. Events tied to specific real-world locations and timeframes became permanently inaccessible once they ended, creating a form of temporal preservation loss that traditional archival approaches couldn't address. The social and cultural impact of mobile gaming's massive preservation failure receives extensive documentation in the archive's Cultural Studies wing. Mobile games had achieved unprecedented reach across age groups, economic classes, and geographic regions, creating shared cultural experiences that transcended traditional gaming demographics. When these games disappeared, they took with them a form of democratic cultural participation that had briefly made gaming accessible to virtually anyone with a smartphone. The archive preserves particularly poignant accounts from elderly players who had discovered gaming through accessible mobile experiences, only to find that the games that had provided cognitive stimulation, social connection, and entertainment became inaccessible as devices and operating systems evolved beyond their technical comfort levels. These preservation failures didn't just affect gaming enthusiasts. They eliminated cultural experiences that had become meaningful parts of many people's daily lives. Mobile gaming's integration with social media platforms created additional preservation challenges when those integration systems evolved or disappeared. Games that had relied on Facebook connectivity, Twitter sharing, or platform-specific social features often became partially non-functional when those integration systems changed their APIs or terms of service. The archive documents hundreds of games that remained technically playable, but lost the social features that had defined their appeal and cultural significance. The China Mobile Gaming collection illustrates how geographic and regulatory factors amplified mobile gaming's preservation challenges in specific markets. Games developed for Chinese mobile platforms often incorporated features designed for local social networks, payment systems, and regulatory requirements that made them impossible to preserve or experience outside their original commercial and cultural contexts. When those platforms evolved or games lost their publishing licenses, unique gaming experiences disappeared entirely from global cultural accessibility. The archives, casual gaming revolution. Documentation reveals how mobile platforms had briefly created space for gaming experiences that appealed to audiences traditional gaming had never successfully reached. Simple puzzle games, casual simulation experiences, and social gaming experiments achieved massive popularity among players who had never engaged with console or PC gaming. When these games disappeared, they took with them evidence of gaming's potential to serve broader cultural functions beyond entertainment for dedicated gaming enthusiasts. Perhaps most significantly, the archive documents how mobile gaming's preservation failures eliminated most of the evidence of gaming's most experimental period. Mobile platforms' low development costs and easy distribution had enabled small developers and individual creators to experiment with interaction design, narrative innovation, and artistic expression in ways that traditional gaming's higher barriers to entry had prevented. These experiments, which might have influenced gaming's long-term creative evolution, vanished when the economic and technical pressures of mobile platform evolution made their preservation impossible. As we contemplate the scope of mobile gaming's preservation catastrophe in the archive's evening atmosphere, there's something almost overwhelming about recognizing how much cultural experimentation and democratic participation was lost when these platforms evolved beyond the games they had originally enabled. The mobile gaming massacre wasn't caused by dramatic commercial failures or technical catastrophes, but by the accumulated pressure of incremental platform evolution that made preservation economically and technically impossible across an entire generation of interactive experiences. The wisdom that emerges from examining mobile gaming's systematic preservation failure is sobering recognition that technological democratization doesn't guarantee cultural preservation. The same factors that made mobile gaming accessible to unprecedented numbers of people, low barriers to entry, rapid platform evolution, minimal preservation infrastructure, also made it uniquely vulnerable to systematic loss when platform priorities shifted toward newer experiences and features. In the archive's virtual communities wing, we encounter perhaps the most emotionally resonant aspect of gaming's digital dark age: the complete elimination of persistent social spaces where human relationships had formed, thrived, and become meaningful parts of people's lives. The lighting here pulses gently, like a slow digital heartbeat, reflecting the profound human connections that once animated these virtual spaces before they quietly extinguished forever. The preserved documentation reveals that virtual worlds represented more than just gaming experiences. They functioned as social infrastructure that enabled forms of human interaction and community formation that had never existed before in human history. When these worlds disappeared, they eliminated not just entertainment software, but genuine social spaces where people had built relationships, created cultural expressions, and developed their identities in ways that extended far beyond traditional gaming. Second Life occupies a central place in this documentation, representing both the peak achievement and the ultimate fragility of persistent virtual worlds. At its height in the mid-2000s, Second Life hosted a complex economy, educational institutions, artistic communities, and social relationships that paralleled or exceeded the complexity of many physical communities. The archive preserves extensive documentation of the creative works, business ventures, and personal relationships that developed within Second Life's virtual infrastructure. Yet Second Life's gradual decline also demonstrated how virtual worlds could experience slow social death, even while remaining technically active. As user populations declined and moved to other platforms, the social density that had made Second Life meaningful gradually evaporated, leaving technically functional but culturally empty spaces. The Archive's population analysis charts show how virtual worlds could become ghostly versions of their former selves, maintaining their technical infrastructure while losing the social energy that had made them viable communities. Club Penguin represents a different but equally significant form of virtual world loss, documented extensively in the Archive's Youth Culture collection. Disney's decision to close Club Penguin in 2017 eliminated what had been many children's first experience with persistent online community. The Archive preserves thousands of accounts from players who described Club Penguin as a formative social experience, where they learned to navigate online relationships, creative expression, and collaborative play within safe, moderated environments. The closure didn't just eliminate a game. It destroyed a virtual space that had served genuine social functions for millions of children worldwide. The Archive documents how many former players attempted to recreate community around unofficial Club Penguin servers, demonstrating the lasting social value that the original experience had provided, and the difficulty of replacing established virtual communities once they disappeared. Habbo Hotel provides another fascinating case study in virtual social space preservation, documented in the Archive's Virtual Architecture Wing. The game's hotel room-based social interaction model had created a unique form of virtual architecture where players could design, customize, and host social events within persistent digital spaces. When various regional versions of Habbo closed or merged, they eliminated not just game access, but the virtual architecture and social memories that players had created over years of community participation. The Archive preserves extensive visual documentation of these lost virtual spaces, screenshots of virtual homes, recordings of social events, and transcripts of conversations that reveal the genuine emotional investment that players made in virtual environments. These artifacts demonstrate how virtual worlds had enabled forms of creative and social expression that couldn't be replicated in other media or platforms. MMORPG's social dimensions created particularly complex preservation challenges because their game mechanics were inseparable from their social functions. Guilds in World of Warcraft, corporations in EVE Online, alliances in Dark Age of Camelot. These social structures had developed their own histories, cultures, and relationship patterns that existed only within specific gaming contexts. When games shut down, these social organizations couldn't transfer to other platforms without losing their historical context and cultural meaning. The Archive's Guild History collection preserves some of the most detailed documentation of virtual social organization available anywhere in cultural research. Guild websites, forum discussions, and event recordings show how virtual world communities developed sophisticated leadership structures, conflict resolution mechanisms, and cultural traditions that paralleled real-world social organizations while remaining uniquely adapted to virtual environment constraints. Virtual world economies represented another dimension of social infrastructure that disappeared completely when underlying games shut down. The Archive documents virtual marketplaces, crafting cooperatives, and service industries that had developed within game worlds, creating economic relationships that extended beyond gameplay into forms of virtual labor and entrepreneurship. When these worlds vanished, they eliminated not just entertainment experiences, but economic systems, where people had invested genuine time and effort in ways that had created real value and meaning. The virtual real estate. Documentation reveals how players had treated virtual land and property ownership as genuine investment in persistent virtual infrastructure. Players who had spent years developing virtual homes, businesses, or community spaces discovered that all of this investment could vanish instantly when hosting companies changed their business strategies or when player populations declined below sustainable levels. Educational and cultural institutions that had established presence in virtual worlds faced unique preservation challenges when those worlds disappeared. The archive preserves documentation of universities that had built virtual campuses, museums that had created virtual exhibitions, and libraries that had developed virtual resource collections. These institutions had invested in virtual infrastructure as a form of cultural outreach, only to discover that virtual presence could be eliminated completely when platform priorities changed. The Archive's Romance and Relationships section documents one of the most personally significant aspects of virtual world loss: the elimination of spaces where genuine romantic relationships had formed and developed. Virtual worlds had provided social environments where people could meet, interact, and develop emotional connections that often extended into real-world relationships and marriages. When these worlds disappeared, they eliminated not just the spaces where relationships had begun, but the virtual locations that held romantic and emotional significance for couples who had met there. Perhaps most poignantly, the archive documents how virtual memorial services and commemorative spaces within virtual worlds provided unique approaches to grief processing and community mourning that couldn't be replicated in other media. Virtual worlds had enabled forms of collective memory and memorial practice that were unprecedented in human culture, allowing communities to create persistent monuments and gathering spaces for processing loss and maintaining connection to deceased community members. The international scope of virtual world communities created additional preservation challenges when worlds shut down. The archive documents how games like Ragnarok Online and MapleStory had developed distinct regional communities with their own cultural practices, languages, and social norms. When regional servers closed or merged, they often eliminated culturally specific virtual communities that couldn't be adequately preserved or recreated on different servers or platforms. As our contemplation deepens in the archive's gentle evening atmosphere, the preserved fragments of these virtual social spaces seem to pulse with the echo of human connection and community building. There's something profoundly moving about recognizing that these technical systems had enabled new forms of human social organization and cultural expression that existed only briefly before vanishing as completely as if they had been merely dreams. The wisdom that emerges from examining virtual world preservation failures is recognition that these losses weren't just technological or commercial, but fundamentally social and cultural. When virtual worlds disappeared, they eliminated forms of human community and cultural expression that were unique products of the intersection between digital technology and human social needs. These losses represent not just lost software, but lost models for how human community might develop in digital environments. As our contemplative journey continues into the archive's artistic heritage wing, we encounter perhaps the most culturally devastating aspect of gaming's digital dark age: the complete loss of creative innovations, artistic experiments, and design breakthroughs that existed only within games that are now permanently inaccessible. The lighting here shifts through subtle color gradations, reflecting the diverse artistic visions that once pushed the boundaries of interactive expression before vanishing into digital oblivion. The archive's preservation team has documented that approximately 75% of gaming's experimental and artistic content from the 2010-2025 period has become completely inaccessible, representing one of the largest losses of contemporary digital art in cultural history. Unlike traditional art forms, which leave physical artifacts that can be preserved independently of their original context, gaming's artistic innovations were inextricably embedded within complex technical systems that proved impossible to maintain when commercial support ended. The interactive art wing preserves documentation of games that push the boundaries between entertainment software and contemporary artistic expression. Titles like Everything, which explored philosophical concepts through innovative simulation mechanics, or Proteus, which created contemplative landscape experiences that challenged traditional notions of game objectives and player agency. These works represented genuine contributions to contemporary art discourse, yet they became as inaccessible as if they had never been created when their supporting platforms evolved beyond compatibility. Consider the quiet tragedy documented in the archive's experimental interfaces collection. Developers had used mobile gaming platforms to explore touch-based interaction languages that were entirely unprecedented in human-computer interaction. Games like Device 6, which integrated reading, audio, and spatial navigation through multi-touch interfaces, created new vocabularies for digital expression that influenced design thinking far beyond gaming. Yet these interface innovations became impossible to experience when mobile platform evolution broke compatibility with their original interaction models. The archive's procedural art section documents another significant category of artistic loss. Games like No Man's Sky's early iterations and Spore's creature creation systems had explored algorithmic approaches to content generation that represented genuine innovations in computational creativity. While some of these games survived in evolved forms, their original artistic visions, the specific aesthetic and systematic approaches that had made them culturally significant, often became inaccessible when developers updated them to meet changing commercial requirements. Virtual reality gaming's brief experimental period produced particularly devastating artistic losses documented in the archive's immersive expression wing. Early VR experiences had explored spatial storytelling, embodied interaction, and presence-based emotional design that were entirely unprecedented in any previous art form. Games like Tilt Brush enabled three-dimensional artistic creation within virtual space, while experiences like the Night Cafe created immersive encounters with famous artistic works that transformed how people could engage with cultural heritage. Yet VR's rapid hardware evolution and platform fragmentation made most of these early artistic experiments completely inaccessible within just a few years of their creation. The archive preserves video documentation and written descriptions of VR experiences that no longer function on any available hardware, representing a form of artistic loss analogous to discovering that ancient frescoes could only be experienced through written descriptions rather than direct visual encounter. Sound design innovations within gaming represented another category of artistic achievement that became permanently inaccessible when their host games disappeared. The archive's audio archaeology collection documents sophisticated approaches to adaptive music, three-dimensional audio environments, and interactive sound design that pushed the boundaries of how audio could create emotional and spatial meaning within interactive contexts. Games like Res HD's synesthetic approach to audio-visual integration or Journey's innovative multiplayer musical communication had created new possibilities for auditory artistic expression. When these games became inaccessible, they eliminated not just entertainment experiences, but genuine innovations in audio art that had influenced composers, sound designers, and audio engineers far beyond the gaming industry. The archive preserves recordings and technical documentation of these audio innovations, but the interactive elements that made them artistically significant, the way sound responded to player choices and actions, cannot be recreated through passive documentation. The narrative innovation. Wing documents how gaming's unique capacity for interactive storytelling had produced experimental narrative forms that existed nowhere else in cultural expression. Games like Her Story, which fragmented narrative through database search mechanics, or 30 Flights of Loving, which explored nonlinear storytelling through environmental design and editing techniques borrowed from cinema, but adapted for interactive exploration. These narrative experiments represented genuine contributions to contemporary storytelling that influenced writers, filmmakers, and interactive designers across multiple media. Yet, when the games containing these innovations became inaccessible, they eliminated unique forms of narrative art that couldn't be adequately preserved or experienced through traditional documentation methods. The archive's narrative analysis reveals how many of these storytelling innovations were inseparable from their interactive implementation, making them impossible to preserve through text or video recording. Visual art within gaming had achieved particularly sophisticated heights during the 2010s, with independent developers exploring artistic styles and aesthetic approaches that challenged traditional commercial gaming's visual conventions. The archive's visual poetry collection documents games like Gris, which integrated watercolor painting techniques with interactive animation, or Abzu, which created underwater environments that functioned as moving abstract art installations. The loss of these visual art achievements represented more than just lost entertainment. It eliminated unique explorations of how visual beauty could be integrated with interactive engagement to create aesthetic experiences that were unprecedented in art history. The archive preserves screenshots and video recordings, but these static documentation methods cannot capture the aesthetic impact of inhabiting and navigating through these visual environments as active participants rather than passive observers. Collaborative artistic creation within gaming represented another unique art form that became impossible to preserve when supporting platforms disappeared. Games like Little Big Planet had enabled community-based artistic creation, where players could build interactive experiences for other players to discover and enjoy. The archive documents how these platforms had fostered creative communities that produced thousands of user-generated artistic works that represented collective creative expression on an unprecedented scale. When these collaborative creation platforms shut down, they eliminated not just individual creative works, but entire models for community-based artistic production that had enabled forms of collective creativity unique to interactive media. The archive's user-generated art collection preserves documentation of some of these collaborative creative works, but the social and interactive contexts that made them meaningful as community art cannot be recreated through archival preservation alone. The integration of augmented reality with gaming had produced brief but significant explorations of how digital art could interact with physical environments in real time. Games like Pokémon Go and Ingress had demonstrated how location-based gaming could transform everyday physical spaces into canvases for digital artistic expression, while apps like Minecraft Earth had enabled collaborative building of virtual structures overlaid onto real-world locations. These AR art experiments represented entirely new categories of artistic expression that existed at the intersection of physical and digital space. When the platforms supporting these experiences shut down, they eliminated not just games but unique art forms that had explored how digital creativity could enhance and transform real-world environments. The archive's hybrid reality art documentation reveals experimental approaches to space-based artistic creation that existed nowhere else in contemporary art practice. Educational gaming's artistic achievements represented attempts to integrate aesthetic beauty with learning objectives in ways that challenged traditional boundaries between education and artistic experience. Games like Never Alone, which integrated indigenous storytelling traditions with environmental exploration, or Walden, which created contemplative philosophical experiences based on transcendentalist literature, had demonstrated how gaming could serve as a medium for cultural and intellectual artistic expression. The loss of these educational art games eliminated unique demonstrations of how interactive media could serve cultural preservation, philosophical exploration, and aesthetic education simultaneously. The archive preserves extensive documentation of how these games had been used in educational contexts to create artistic and intellectual experiences that were impossible to achieve through traditional educational media. The archive's technical artistry wing documents how gaming had pushed the boundaries of real-time computer graphics, physics simulation, and artificial intelligence in ways that represented genuine technical art achievements. Games that explored photorealistic environmental simulation, advanced lighting models, or sophisticated artificial intelligence behaviors had created technical artistic expressions that influenced computer graphics research and digital art production far beyond gaming applications. As we contemplate these artistic losses in the archive's evolving evening light, there's something particularly profound about recognizing how much creative innovation was embedded within interactive systems that proved too complex and commercially dependent to preserve. Each lost game represented not just missing entertainment software, but vanished contributions to the development of digital art, interactive design, and computational creativity. The wisdom that emerges from examining gaming's lost artistic heritage is recognition that interactive media had briefly enabled forms of artistic expression that were unprecedented in cultural history. Art forms that existed only through the combination of visual, audio, narrative, and interactive elements working together within complex technical systems. When these systems became inaccessible, they eliminated not just individual artistic works, but entire categories of artistic possibility that can now be studied only through incomplete documentation rather than direct experience. Moving deeper into the archive's educational heritage section, we discover perhaps the most quietly devastating long-term consequence of gaming's digital dark age: the systematic elimination of interactive educational experiences that had demonstrated new possibilities for learning, cultural preservation, and historical understanding. The gentle ambient lighting here seems tinged with particular melancholy, as it illuminates the remnants of what might have been transformative educational innovations. The archive's quantitative research reveals that approximately 83% of educational games created between 2008 and 2025 became permanently inaccessible by 2030, representing one of the largest losses of contemporary educational innovation in modern pedagogical history. Unlike traditional educational materials, which could be preserved through physical artifact retention or simple digital documentation, educational games required complex interactive systems that proved impossible to maintain when institutional support and commercial viability ended. The historical simulation wing preserves documentation of games that had achieved unprecedented sophistication in making historical periods accessible and understandable through direct interactive experience. Titles like Assassin's Creed Discovery Mode had eliminated traditional game combat and objectives to create pure historical exploration experiences, allowing users to walk through historically accurate reconstructions of ancient Egypt, Renaissance Italy, and Viking-era England, while receiving contextual information about daily life, architecture, and cultural practices. When Ubisoft discontinued support for these Discovery Mode experiences, they eliminated educational tools that historians and educators had recognized as genuinely innovative approaches to historical understanding. The archive preserves extensive documentation from educators who described these interactive historical environments as more effective for student engagement and learning retention than traditional textbooks, documentaries, or even museum exhibitions. The loss wasn't just pedagogical, but genuinely historical. These games had incorporated years of archaeological research, historical consultation, and cultural reconstruction that represented significant scholarly investment. When the interactive systems that made this historical knowledge accessible disappeared, they took with them educational resources that had cost millions of dollars and thousands of research hours to create. Language learning games represented another category of educational innovation, whose loss had lasting cultural impact. The archives, linguistic diversity, collection documents how games had begun to preserve endangered languages through interactive learning systems that traditional educational approaches couldn't support effectively. Games that taught indigenous languages, regional dialects, and culturally specific communication patterns had created learning experiences that connected language education with cultural immersion in unprecedented ways. When these language learning games became inaccessible, they eliminated not just educational tools, but actual mechanisms for cultural preservation. Some endangered languages had achieved their most sophisticated digital preservation through gaming systems that made language learning engaging and culturally contextual. The loss of these systems represented a form of cultural heritage destruction that affected linguistic diversity preservation efforts worldwide. The archive's scientific education wing documents how gaming had achieved remarkable success in making complex scientific concepts accessible through interactive simulation and experimentation. Games like Space Chem, which taught chemistry concepts through puzzle-based molecular construction, or Kerbal Space Program, which demonstrated orbital mechanics and aerospace engineering through hands-on spacecraft design, had proven more effective for STEM education than traditional classroom approaches in numerous academic studies. These educational games had succeeded because they allowed students to experiment, fail, and iterate within safe virtual environments where abstract concepts became tangible through interactive manipulation. When these games became inaccessible, educational institutions lost teaching tools that had demonstrated measurable improvements in student understanding and engagement with difficult scientific concepts. Virtual field trips and cultural exploration games had created educational opportunities that were previously impossible for logistical and economic reasons. The archive documents how games enabled virtual visits to historically significant locations, natural environments, and cultural sites that most students could never access physically. These virtual educational experiences had made global cultural heritage accessible to classrooms worldwide, democratizing educational opportunities in unprecedented ways. The loss of these virtual educational experiences eliminated teaching resources that had enabled forms of global cultural exchange and historical education that physical field trips couldn't provide. Students in rural or economically disadvantaged areas had gained access to sophisticated cultural and historical education through gaming systems that became completely inaccessible when technical support ended. Medical and healthcare education games represented particularly significant losses documented in the Archive's Professional Education collection. Interactive anatomy systems, surgical simulation games, and diagnostic training programs had enabled medical education approaches that were more effective and accessible than traditional cadaver-based or textbook learning. These games had democratized access to sophisticated medical training resources that were previously available only at well-funded medical institutions. When medical education games became inaccessible, they eliminated teaching resources that had proven effective for training healthcare professionals in resource-limited environments. The archive preserves documentation of medical programs in developing countries that had relied on gaming systems to provide training experiences that would otherwise have required equipment and resources far beyond their institutional capabilities. Social-emotional learning games had achieved remarkable success in helping children and adolescents develop emotional intelligence, conflict resolution skills, and social competence through safe interactive practice. The archives, developmental education, Wing documents how these games provided structured environments for practicing social skills that traditional educational approaches couldn't simulate effectively. The loss of social-emotional learning games eliminated educational tools that had been particularly effective for students with autism spectrum disorders, social anxiety, and other conditions that made traditional social skill instruction challenging. These games had provided individualized, non-judgmental learning environments where students could practice social interaction at their own pace and comfort level. Environmental education games had created sophisticated simulations of ecological systems that enabled students to understand complex environmental relationships through direct manipulation and experimentation. Games that simulated climate change, ecosystem management, and resource conservation had made abstract environmental concepts tangible through interactive experience that traditional environmental education couldn't provide. When these environmental education games disappeared, they eliminated teaching tools that had proven effective for helping students understand complex ecological relationships and environmental challenges. The archive documents how environmental engineering programs had used these games to teach systems thinking and environmental problem-solving approaches that were difficult to convey through traditional instructional methods. Cultural heritage preservation games had enabled forms of cultural education that connected contemporary students with traditional practices, historical craftsmanship, and cultural knowledge that was difficult to preserve through conventional documentation. Games that taught traditional crafts, historical practices, and cultural traditions had created immersive learning experiences that preserved cultural knowledge in interactive form. The loss of cultural heritage games eliminated educational resources that had enabled cultural preservation and transmission in ways that traditional museum exhibitions and cultural documentation couldn't achieve. These games had made cultural heritage accessible to younger generations in formats that connected with contemporary learning preferences while maintaining cultural authenticity and educational value. The archives, special needs education, collection documents how gaming had achieved remarkable success in creating educational experiences for students with diverse learning differences and physical disabilities. Games designed for dyslexia support, ADHD management, and motor skills development had provided therapeutic educational experiences that were more engaging and effective than traditional special education approaches. When special needs educational games became inaccessible, they eliminated teaching resources that had proven particularly effective for students who struggled with traditional educational methods. The archive preserves extensive documentation from educators and parents describing how specific games had enabled educational breakthrough moments for students with learning differences who had not responded well to conventional instructional approaches. As we settle deeper into contemplation of these educational losses in the archive's evening atmosphere, there's something particularly profound about recognizing how much pedagogical innovation was eliminated when gaming's supporting infrastructure disappeared. These weren't just lost entertainment experiences, but vanished demonstrations of how interactive technology could enhance human learning, cultural preservation, and educational democratization. The wisdom that emerges from examining gaming's lost educational heritage is recognition that interactive learning had briefly achieved educational innovations that demonstrated new possibilities for how humans could acquire knowledge, develop skills, and engage with cultural heritage. When these educational games became inaccessible, they eliminated not just teaching tools, but models for educational approaches that might have transformed how learning occurred across multiple generations. In the archive's corporate studies wing, we find ourselves examining the complex intersection of business responsibility and economic pragmatism that shaped gaming's preservation landscape. The lighting here is more neutral and clinical, reflecting the dispassionate nature of corporate decision-making, while acknowledging the human impact of choices made in boardrooms far removed from the communities affected by preservation decisions. The preserved corporate documentation reveals a consistent pattern of well-intentioned policies colliding with inexorable economic realities. Gaming companies rarely set out to destroy cultural heritage or eliminate player access to meaningful experiences. Instead, preservation failures typically emerged from the accumulated pressure of operational costs, technical debt, legal complexity, and resource allocation decisions that prioritized immediate business sustainability over long-term cultural preservation. The archive's corporate communications collection preserves hundreds of shutdown announcements, each following remarkably similar templates that expressed appreciation for player communities, explained economic necessities, and promised to preserve player interests within existing constraints. These communications reveal the genuine tension that corporate leaders faced between business viability and community support, suggesting that preservation failures often occurred despite corporate intentions rather than because of corporate malice. Nintendo's approach to preservation during this period provided one model for how established companies attempted to balance commercial interests with cultural responsibility. The archive documents Nintendo's relatively systematic approach to backward compatibility, virtual console preservation, and advance notice for service discontinuations. Yet even Nintendo's preservation efforts were limited by economic realities that made comprehensive preservation impossible when maintaining legacy systems required ongoing investment that exceeded their revenue potential. Consider the case study of Sony's PlayStation Store closures, extensively documented in the archive's platform transition section. Sony initially announced plans to close PlayStation 3 and PlayStation Vita stores with relatively short notice, facing immediate community backlash that revealed the cultural significance of games that existed only within those storefronts. The company's subsequent decision to delay some closures demonstrated both responsiveness to community concerns and the economic constraints that made indefinite preservation impossible. The archive's analysis reveals how Sony's approach illustrated the typical corporate preservation dilemma. Maintaining legacy systems required ongoing technical and financial resources that declining user populations couldn't justify. Yet closure decisions eliminated access to cultural content that retained significant meaning for affected communities. Sony's compromise solution, extending closure timelines while maintaining the inevitability of eventual discontinuation, represented an attempt to balance commercial necessity with cultural sensitivity. Electronic Arts' approach to sports game licensing provides another illuminating case study in how corporate preservation decisions were shaped by external legal and economic constraints beyond individual company control. The archive documents how EA's sports titles faced systematic preservation challenges due to licensing agreements with professional leagues, player associations, and media companies that were designed for specific time periods rather than indefinite cultural preservation. When these licensing agreements expired, EA faced choices between paying renewal fees that often exceeded games' ongoing revenue, removing licensed content to enable continued distribution, or discontinuing games entirely. The archive's documentation reveals how these licensing decisions were typically made by entities outside EA's control, professional sports leagues and player associations, whose primary concerns were maximizing current revenue rather than preserving historical gaming experiences. The rise of independent gaming publishers created different preservation challenges that revealed how company size and structure affected preservation capabilities. The Archive's independent publisher collection documents how smaller companies often had fewer resources available for maintaining legacy games when their focus needed to remain on developing new titles for commercial survival. Independent developers frequently understood the cultural value of their games and wanted to support long-term preservation, but they lacked the technical infrastructure, legal expertise, and financial reserves necessary to maintain games indefinitely when ongoing revenues declined. The archive preserves numerous cases where independent developers attempted community-supported preservation, but were prevented by legal complexities or technical requirements that exceeded their capabilities. Mobile platform holders, primarily Apple and Google, faced unique preservation challenges because their business models prioritized platform evolution over backward compatibility. The archive's platform evolution wing documents how mobile platforms' rapid hardware and software development cycles created systematic pressure to deprecate older apps and games to maintain platform performance and security. These platform evolution decisions weren't motivated by hostility toward game preservation, but by technical and security requirements that made maintaining compatibility with older software increasingly difficult and potentially dangerous for platform integrity. The archive reveals how mobile platforms' preservation challenges emerged from the tension between innovation pace and backward compatibility that affected the entire mobile software ecosystem. The archive's acquisition impact section documents how corporate mergers and acquisitions often created preservation challenges even when both companies supported game preservation in principle. When companies acquired game developers or publishers, they inherited complex technical systems, licensing agreements, and legal obligations that were often poorly documented and difficult to maintain. Corporate acquisition due diligence typically focused on acquiring ongoing business operations and intellectual property rather than preservation obligations, meaning that acquired companies' legacy games often became orphaned when new corporate owners couldn't justify the costs of maintaining systems they hadn't designed and didn't fully understand. Cloud gaming services represented the most extreme form of corporate preservation challenge because their business models made traditional preservation approaches impossible. The archive documents how Stadia, GeForce Now, and other cloud gaming platforms created games that existed entirely within corporate infrastructure, with no preservation pathway that didn't require ongoing corporate commitment. When these companies decided to discontinue cloud gaming services, they faced the reality that game preservation would require infinite corporate subsidy of server infrastructure and ongoing maintenance. The archive reveals how cloud gaming companies generally understood the preservation implications of their business models, but believed that market success would create economic sustainability that would make preservation concerns irrelevant. The archive's legal compliance wing documents how corporate preservation decisions were often constrained by legal frameworks that prioritized intellectual property protection and commercial licensing over cultural preservation. Companies that wanted to support game preservation often found themselves legally unable to provide access to games due to licensing restrictions, trademark obligations, and copyright protections that prevented preservation, even when economic considerations would have supported continued access. Corporate open source initiatives represented one approach to preservation that some companies explored as alternatives to complete game elimination. The archive documents cases where companies released source code or development tools to enable community preservation when commercial preservation was no longer viable. These open source preservation efforts achieved mixed success, often preserving technical systems while losing content assets that remained subject to licensing restrictions. The international scope of gaming companies created additional preservation challenges when corporate decisions had to accommodate different legal frameworks, cultural expectations, and regulatory requirements across multiple markets. The archive documents how preservation approaches that were viable in some countries became impossible in others due to different copyright laws, content regulation, and customer protection requirements. As we contemplate these corporate preservation challenges in the archive's neutral lighting, there's something sobering about recognizing how preservation failures typically resulted from the intersection of multiple constraints rather than single corporate decisions. The accumulated pressure of technical debt, legal complexity, economic sustainability, and operational requirements created systematic pressures that made preservation difficult even for companies that supported it in principle. The wisdom that emerges from examining corporate preservation efforts is recognition that business sustainability and cultural preservation operated according to different timeframes and value systems that were often impossible to reconcile within commercial frameworks. Understanding these corporate constraints doesn't excuse preservation failures, but it does provide insight into why preservation required systematic social and legal support rather than relying on individual corporate goodwill and voluntary preservation efforts. In the archive's speculative preservation wing, we encounter a more contemplative examination of how gaming's digital dark age might have unfolded differently under alternative technological, legal, or economic circumstances. The lighting here shifts subtly between different scenarios, each casting the preserved artifacts in slightly different hues, as if illuminating parallel universes where different preservation outcomes had emerged. The archive's alternative infrastructure models demonstrate how different technological architectures might have enabled more sustainable game preservation. Consider the path not taken where gaming platforms had adopted distributed preservation protocols similar to those used by academic libraries and digital archives. In this alternative timeline, games would have been designed from the beginning with preservation metadata, standardized save format requirements, and distributed backup systems that could have maintained access even when original publishers discontinued support. The preserved technical specifications reveal how blockchain-based distribution systems, despite their environmental and complexity costs, might have created preservation-friendly models where games could persist independently of their original publishers. In this alternative scenario, purchasing a game would have meant acquiring verifiable ownership of preservation-enabled software that couldn't be revoked by platform changes or corporate decisions. Players would have become stakeholders in distributed preservation networks rather than license holders dependent on corporate infrastructure. Dr. Chen's alternative history research explores how different legal frameworks might have created more preservation-friendly gaming ecosystems. The archive documents proposed legislation from the 2010s that would have required software publishers to provide preservation options before discontinuing services. In this alternative legal landscape, companies would have been legally obligated to release server code, provide offline functionality, or transfer games to community preservation organizations before shutdown. This preserved legislation reveals how legal requirements for preservation planning could have changed corporate behavior throughout the development process. Games would have been designed with legal obligation to provide preservation pathways, creating technical architectures that supported long-term access from the beginning rather than treating preservation as an afterthought that became economically impossible to implement retroactively. The archive's economic models. Wing explores how different business models might have created more preservation-friendly gaming ecosystems. In alternative scenarios, where gaming had developed around perpetual ownership models rather than service licensing, players would have purchased software with explicit guarantees of ongoing access that were legally enforceable regardless of corporate changes. Cooperative ownership models might have enabled player communities to collectively maintain games when commercial publishers could no longer support them economically. In this alternative framework, successful games would have transitioned to community ownership structures, where ongoing maintenance costs were shared among users who valued continued access enough to contribute financially to preservation efforts. The archive preserves speculation about how open-source gaming development might have created more resilient preservation ecosystems. In alternative timelines, where proprietary gaming engines were replaced by open-source alternatives, game preservation would have been technically feasible regardless of corporate support decisions. Community developers could have maintained compatibility, fixed compatibility issues, and adapted games to newer platforms without requiring permission or assistance from original publishers. This open-source alternative would have facing different challenges. Community projects often lacked the polish and marketing resources of commercial games, but they would have created gaming ecosystems where preservation was technically and legally possible for any game that attracted sufficient community interest and expertise. The archive's cultural investment scenarios explore how different social prioritization of digital preservation might have changed gaming's temporal landscape. In alternative scenarios, where governments and cultural institutions had recognized gaming as significant cultural heritage requiring preservation, public funding might have supported systematic game archiving, similar to how libraries preserve books and museums preserve physical artifacts. Large-scale public investment in game preservation could have created redundant preservation infrastructure that wasn't dependent on commercial viability or corporate decision-making. Cultural preservation, organizations with long-term institutional commitments could have maintained access to games that retained cultural significance even when they were no longer commercially profitable. The international cooperation models preserved in the archive suggest how global coordination might have created more robust preservation ecosystems. In alternative scenarios, where countries had developed preservation sharing agreements similar to those used for academic research and cultural artifacts, games would have been preserved across multiple jurisdictions with different legal frameworks and institutional commitments. This distributed international preservation would have made systematic loss less likely, because games would have needed to fail preservation efforts across multiple countries and legal systems simultaneously. International cooperation might have enabled preservation even when original publishers couldn't maintain access within specific countries or legal jurisdictions. The Archive's player agency wing explores how different relationships between players and gaming companies might have created more preservation-friendly dynamics. In alternative scenarios, where players had legal ownership, rights similar to those for physical media, gaming companies would have been unable to revoke access unilaterally or eliminate games through platform changes. Enhanced player agency might have enabled community preservation efforts that were legally protected rather than existing in legal gray areas that made preservation risky for community organizers. Players with explicit legal rights to preservation could have demanded technical architecture that supported community maintenance and could have challenged corporate preservation decisions through legal mechanisms. The archive preserves speculation about how different timing of preservation awareness might have changed outcomes. If the gaming industry and player communities had recognized preservation challenges earlier in the digital transition, different technical standards and business practices might have emerged that prioritized long-term access alongside commercial functionality. Early preservation awareness might have created industry standards for preservation-friendly development, legal frameworks that protected cultural access rights, and business models that incorporated preservation costs into pricing rather than treating preservation as unprofitable overhead that needed to be minimized or eliminated. The technological speculation wing explores how different computing architectures might have enabled more preservation-friendly gaming ecosystems. Containerized gaming environments that isolated games from operating system dependencies, standardized virtual machine systems that could run games reliably across hardware generations, and modular game architecture that separated core functionality from platform-specific features might have made long-term compatibility more achievable. These alternative technical approaches would have required different development priorities and potentially higher initial costs, but they might have created gaming ecosystems where preservation was technically straightforward rather than requiring complex emulation or reverse engineering efforts that few community projects could sustain. The archive's social innovation scenarios examine how different cultural attitudes toward digital ownership and preservation might have created more sustainable preservation ecosystems. In alternative cultural contexts where digital preservation was understood as collective cultural responsibility rather than individual consumer preference, social pressure might have created market incentives for preservation-friendly business models. Consumer advocacy for preservation rights, similar to environmental consumer movements, might have created market pressure for companies to compete on preservation commitments rather than treating preservation as cost competition disadvantage that needed to be minimized for competitive reasons. As we contemplate these alternative possibilities in the archive's shifting lighting, there's something both hopeful and melancholic about recognizing how different choices at crucial moments might have prevented much of gaming's cultural loss. The technologies, legal frameworks, and business models that could have enabled better preservation often existed, but weren't adopted due to short-term economic pressures and inadequate recognition of preservation's cultural importance. The wisdom that emerges from examining these alternative histories is recognition that gaming's preservation challenges weren't inevitable consequences of technological change, but resulted from specific choices about priorities, legal frameworks, and business models that might have developed differently under alternative circumstances. Understanding these alternative possibilities provides insight into how future digital culture might avoid similar systematic preservation failures through different social and technical organization. As we approach the conclusion of our contemplative journey through the archive, we find ourselves in the forward research wing, where the lessons learned from gaming's digital dark age are being applied to prevent similar cultural losses in emerging digital media. The lighting here carries a subtle warmth, suggesting hope tempered by wisdom gained through significant loss. The archive's preservation design principles, collection documents how the systematic failures of gaming preservation have influenced the development of next-generation digital culture creation tools. Contemporary virtual reality experiences, augmented reality applications, and artificial intelligence-assisted creative tools now incorporate preservation considerations from their initial design stages rather than treating long-term access as an afterthought that becomes economically impossible to implement retroactively. Modern digital culture platforms have adopted what researchers call preservation-first architecture, technical systems designed to ensure that created content remains accessible independent of platform-specific infrastructure. These approaches learned directly from gaming's failures by requiring standardized exports, offline functionality, and community preservation hooks that enable cultural works to survive platform evolution or commercial discontinuation. The legal framework evolution documented in the archive reveals how gaming's preservation failures contributed to broader recognition of digital cultural rights. Legal protections for access to digital cultural heritage that parallel the physical cultural heritage protection that museums and libraries had established over previous centuries. Contemporary legislation in multiple countries now requires digital platform providers to offer preservation pathways before discontinuing cultural content services. These legal protections emerged directly from advocacy efforts led by people who had experienced gaming preservation losses firsthand. The archive preserves documentation of how former gamers became digital preservation activists, using their understanding of systematic cultural loss to advocate for legal frameworks that would protect future digital cultural interactions from similar elimination. Educational institutions have radically modified their approaches to digital culture preservation based on lessons learned from gaming's systematic failures. The archive's institutional learning wing documents how universities, libraries, and cultural organizations now maintain distributed preservation networks that operate independently of commercial platforms and corporate decision-making processes. These institutional preservation efforts specifically target interactive digital experiences, recognizing that traditional archival approaches designed for static media are inadequate for preserving culture that depends on user interaction, community participation, and technical functionality. The preservation methodology that emerged from studying gaming failures has been applied to social media platforms, virtual meeting spaces, and collaborative creative tools that represent contemporary digital culture. The archive preserves extensive documentation of how gaming communities, grassroots preservation efforts, have become models for community-driven cultural protection across multiple digital media formats. The technical expertise, organizational models, and advocacy approaches developed by gaming preservation groups have been adapted by communities working to preserve social media culture, online art installations, and digital performance experiences. Community preservation networks now operate with legal protections and institutional support that gaming preservation efforts never enjoyed, benefiting from policy advocacy and public awareness campaigns that were inspired by gaming's cultural losses. These community efforts represent systematic approaches to cultural protection that learned from gaming's experience but operate within more supportive legal and social frameworks. The Archive's Economic Innovation section documents how alternative business models have emerged that specifically address the sustainability challenges that made gaming preservation economically impossible for most commercial entities. Contemporary digital culture platforms increasingly adopt cooperative ownership models, community-supported preservation funding, and transitions to open-source systems that enable long-term cultural access regardless of commercial viability. These economic innovations address the fundamental tension between commercial sustainability and cultural preservation that caused most of gaming's systematic losses. By designing preservation costs into initial business models and providing community ownership transition options, contemporary digital culture creation platforms avoid the impossible economic pressures that made gaming preservation dependent on perpetual commercial success. The international coordination frameworks preserved in the archive reveal how gaming's preservation failures contributed to development of global cultural preservation treaties and coordination systems that operate independently of commercial interests or individual national policies. Contemporary digital culture benefits from international preservation networks that provide redundant access across multiple legal jurisdictions and institutional frameworks. These international preservation systems specifically target interactive digital experiences and community-dependent cultural formats, recognizing that traditional UNESCO cultural heritage protection frameworks were inadequate for preserving digital culture that depends on technological infrastructure and community participation rather than physical artifact preservation alone. The archive documents how artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies have been developed specifically to address preservation challenges that gaming communities faced manually and with limited resources. Contemporary preservation systems use AI-assisted emulation, automated compatibility maintenance, and predictive obsolescence detection that enable more systematic and sustainable digital cultural preservation. These AI preservation tools were designed based on direct study of gaming preservation failures, incorporating lessons about technical debt, platform dependency, and community preservation workflows that had been developed through decades of grassroots gaming preservation efforts. The technology serves preservation goals that gaming communities identified, but lacked resources to address systematically. The social innovation wing preserves documentation of how contemporary digital culture communities have developed social norms and cultural practices that prioritize preservation alongside creation and consumption. Digital culture participants now routinely consider preservation implications of platform choices, advocate for preservation-friendly features, and organize community preservation efforts as standard parts of engagement with digital cultural systems. These social innovations emerged directly from cultural awareness of gaming's preservation failures and recognition that individual consumer choices and community organization could influence whether digital culture survives platform evolution and commercial changes. Contemporary digital culture benefits from preservation awareness that gaming communities developed through direct experience of systematic cultural loss. Educational curricula now include digital preservation literacy that teaches students to evaluate platform preservation commitments, understand technical preservation implications of creative tool choices, and participate effectively in community preservation efforts. These educational approaches were developed based on recognition that preservation requires cultural knowledge and community participation, that gaming preservation efforts had to develop without institutional support. The archive's creative adaptation collection documents how contemporary digital artists and content creators have modified their creative practices to incorporate preservation considerations into artistic decision-making processes. Artists now routinely create works using preservation-friendly technical approaches, maintain preservation-ready archives of their creative processes, and license their works with community preservation permissions. These creative practice modifications enable forms of digital art that are designed for cultural longevity rather than platform optimization, learning from gaming's experience that commercial platform optimization often created artistic works that were impossible to preserve when platform priorities changed. The archive preserves research comparing contemporary digital culture preservation rates with gaming's systematic losses, revealing significant improvements in cultural survival that result directly from applying lessons learned through gaming's failed preservation efforts. While contemporary digital culture still faces preservation challenges, the systematic total losses that characterized gaming's digital dark age have been substantially reduced through technical, legal, social, and economic innovations that learned from gaming communities' experience. The documentation reveals that gaming's preservation failures, while culturally devastating, provided the learning experiences necessary to develop more sustainable approaches to digital cultural preservation that benefit all subsequent digital media forms. The loss of gaming's cultural heritage enabled better protection of contemporary digital culture through hard-won understanding of preservation challenges and systematic approaches to addressing them. As we contemplate these preservation innovations in the archive's hopeful lighting, there's something deeply moving about recognizing how gaming communities' experience of systematic cultural loss contributed to better protection of digital culture for future generations. The preservation awareness and advocacy efforts that emerged from gaming's failures have created more sustainable digital cultural ecosystems that honor the cultural value of interactive experiences. The wisdom that emerges from examining preservation lessons is recognition that cultural loss can contribute to cultural protection when communities learn from preservation failures and adapt their practices to prevent similar losses. Gaming's digital dark age was culturally catastrophic, but it also provided the knowledge and motivation necessary to create digital preservation systems that protect contemporary culture more effectively than the systems that existed during gaming's vulnerable transition period. As our contemplative journey through the archive reaches its gentle conclusion, we find ourselves in the Reflection Observatory, a circular space where the soft glow of holographic displays creates an encompassing view of gaming's digital dark age in its entirety. Here, surrounded by the preserved fragments of a lost cultural epoch, we can finally see the complete pattern of what was gained, what was lost, and what these experiences teach us about the nature of culture, technology, and human meaning in an increasingly digital world. The magnitude of what disappeared between 2008 and 2028 represents one of the most systematic cultural losses in recorded history. An entire medium, one that had achieved unprecedented global reach, creative sophistication, and social significance, experienced near-total preservation, failure across multiple platforms, business models, and technical systems. Yet this loss, devastating as it was, also revealed fundamental truths about digital culture that might have remained hidden if gaming had achieved perfect preservation. Gaming's digital dark age demonstrated that technological solutions alone were insufficient for cultural preservation. Even sophisticated technical systems, backed by substantial commercial investment and serving millions of passionate users, could vanish completely when the economic, legal, and social conditions supporting them changed. The fragility wasn't inherent in the technology, but in the complex web of relationships, commercial, legal, technical, and social, that digital culture required for sustained existence. The systematic nature of gaming's preservation failures revealed how digital culture existed in a fundamentally different relationship to time than previous cultural forms. Physical cultural artifacts degraded slowly, often remaining partially accessible across centuries. Digital culture demonstrated binary existence, perfect functionality, until the moment of complete inaccessibility. This temporal characteristic of digital culture required preservation, approaches that traditional cultural institutions weren't equipped to provide. Yet gaming communities' response to systematic cultural loss also demonstrated remarkable human adaptability and cultural resilience. Faced with the disappearance of meaningful experiences, communities developed preservation techniques, documentation practices, and alternative access methods that often exceeded the sophistication of official preservation efforts. The loss of commercial infrastructure enabled grassroots cultural preservation that revealed gaming's genuine cultural significance through the dedication people showed to maintaining access. The economic realities that drove gaming's preservation failures illuminated the tension between commercial sustainability and cultural value that affects all market-driven cultural production. Gaming's experience revealed that commercial success during active periods provided no guarantee of long-term cultural preservation, and that the economic models that made digital culture creation viable also made long-term preservation economically impossible for most commercial entities. The legal complexities that prevented gaming preservation demonstrated how intellectual property frameworks designed to protect creators during commercial exploitation could become barriers to cultural preservation when commercial interests ended. Gaming's experience contributed to broader recognition that cultural preservation requires legal frameworks specifically designed to balance creator protection with cultural access across extended timeframes. The international scope of gaming's preservation failures revealed how global digital culture required coordination mechanisms that crossed national boundaries and legal jurisdictions. Gaming demonstrated that digital culture could achieve global cultural significance while remaining vulnerable to loss through the decisions of entities located in specific countries operating under particular legal frameworks. The technological lessons learned from gaming preservation failures have influenced the design of contemporary digital cultural systems in ways that make similar systematic losses less likely. Technical architectures now incorporate preservation considerations from initial design stages. Legal frameworks provide stronger protection for cultural access rights, and business models include mechanisms for community preservation when commercial support ends. The social awareness created by gaming's preservation failures has contributed to broader cultural understanding of digital preservation as a collective responsibility rather than something that occurs automatically through technological progress. Communities now approach digital cultural engagement with awareness of preservation implications and actively advocate for preservation-friendly practices across all forms of digital culture. The educational value of gaming's preservation experience extends beyond digital culture to broader questions about how societies can protect meaningful cultural experiences during periods of rapid technological change. Gaming demonstrated both the importance of preserving cultural innovations that emerge through technological development and the difficulty of maintaining access to culture that depends on complex technological systems for its existence. Perhaps most significantly, gaming's digital dark age revealed the profound human capacity for finding meaning and forming community through interactive experiences, even when those experiences proved ephemeral. The depth of loss that people experienced when games disappeared demonstrated that interactive digital culture had achieved genuine cultural significance that deserved preservation attention and institutional support. The preservation successes that did occur within gaming, maintained largely through community effort and individual dedication, showed that cultural preservation was possible when social commitment aligned with technical capability and legal permission. These successes provided models for preservation approaches that have been scaled up and systematized to better protect contemporary digital culture. The emotional and psychological impacts of gaming preservation failures contributed to broader understanding of how digital culture could become meaningful parts of people's lives in ways that created genuine grief when access was lost. Recognition of digital culture's emotional significance has influenced how cultural institutions approach digital preservation and how platform providers consider the human impact of technological decisions. The creative innovations that were lost through gaming's preservation failures represented unique contributions to interactive design, digital art, and computational creativity that influenced cultural development far beyond gaming itself. While these innovations were preserved through influence rather than direct access, their loss demonstrated the importance of preserving cultural works in forms that enable direct experience rather than just documentation. Looking toward the future from our 2035 perspective, gaming's digital dark age appears as a crucial transition period when digital culture confronted its own mortality and began developing more sustainable approaches to cultural preservation. The systematic losses that occurred during gaming's vulnerable period enabled learning that has made contemporary digital culture more resilient and preservation-aware. The communities that experienced gaming's preservation failures became advocates for digital cultural preservation across all media formats, using their understanding of systematic cultural loss to promote legal protections, technical standards, and social practices that better protect digital cultural heritage. Their advocacy has created preservation infrastructure that benefits all subsequent digital cultural development. The wisdom that emerges from contemplating gaming's complete digital dark age is acceptance of impermanence combined with appreciation for the meaning that cultural experiences can create even when they prove temporally limited. Gaming demonstrated that cultural value exists in the experiences and relationships that culture enables rather than in the permanence of cultural artifacts themselves. As we conclude our journey through the archive, the gentle lighting gradually dims to peaceful twilight, reflecting the quiet acceptance that comes from understanding both the scope of what was lost and the value that those losses contributed to protecting contemporary digital culture. Gaming's digital dark age was a cultural tragedy, but it was also a learning experience that enabled more thoughtful approaches to digital cultural preservation. The preserved fragments around us, screenshots, documentation, community memories, serve not as complete replacements for lost experiences, but as reminders of the cultural richness that once existed and evidence of human resilience in the face of systematic cultural loss. They represent both mourning for what disappeared and gratitude for what was learned through that disappearance. In the end, gaming's digital dark age teaches us that cultural preservation requires active social commitment rather than passive technological assumption. that digital culture's unique characteristics demand preservation, approaches designed specifically for interactive and community-dependent experiences, and that the meaning people find in cultural experiences can motivate preservation efforts that exceed the attention that commercial entities can sustainably provide. As we drift toward peaceful reflection on these insights, we carry with us both awareness of digital culture's fragility and appreciation for the human creativity and community commitment that can provide cultural preservation even under challenging technological and economic circumstances. The archive around us stands as testament both to what was lost and to what that loss enabled us to learn about protecting digital culture for future generations. As we reach the end of our contemplative journey through gaming's digital dark age, take a moment to reflect on the digital cultural experiences that have meaningful value in your own life. Consider how the lessons learned from gaming's preservation challenges might apply to the digital culture you engage with today. If this exploration has resonated with you, a gentle like and subscription would help share these insights with others who might find value in understanding how digital culture preservation shapes the experiences available to future generations. What aspects of contemporary digital culture do you think deserve active preservation attention? Share your thoughts in the comments below, as these conversations help build the awareness that makes cultural preservation possible. For those interested in continuing this exploration, consider visiting the related videos on digital preservation, technological archaeology, and the intersection of culture and technology that examine how societies can better protect meaningful digital experiences during periods of rapid technological change. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be filled with peaceful reflection on the stories that shape our digital cultural heritage.